The letter arrived on a Wednesday, which was the cruelest kind of day for bad news. Not a Monday, when a man was already braced for the world's indifference. Not a Friday, when he might at least have the weekend to fall apart in private. A Wednesday, the exact middle of everything, no space to run in either direction. Ulrich Voss read it standing in his study, still in his riding coat, mud on his boots, and a half-eaten apple in his left hand that he forgot was there. His father's handwriting was small and precise on the page, the same handwriting that had once corrected his arithmetic and signed his school reports, now reduced to 2 paragraphs and a name he did not recognize. Lady Seraphine Callow. He read the name twice. He turned the letter over as if there might be something on the back that would change its meaning. There was nothing on the back, there never was. His father was dying. That part he had known for 3 months, known it the way you know a storm is coming when the air changes and the horses grow restless and the light goes flat and yellow over the hills. He had known it, and he had spent those 3 months telling himself he had more time. Men always believe they have more time. It is the particular vanity of the living. What he had not known, what his father had apparently decided, did not require discussion or warning or the basic courtesy of a conversation, was that dying men make arrangements. His father had made one arrangement in particular. He had written to Lord Callow of Staffordshire, a man Ulrich had met exactly once at a hunt 6 years ago, and remembered only as someone who laughed too loudly at his own stories. And he had offered the Voss name, the Voss estate, the Voss dukedom, in exchange for a marriage contract with Lord Callow's eldest daughter. The apple was still in Ulrich's hand. He set it on the desk. He folded the letter. He walked to the window and looked out at the south lawn where the gardener's boy was raking leaves into a pile that the wind kept scattering, and the boy kept raking and the wind kept scattering and the boy did not stop. Ulrich watched this for a long time. He was not thinking about anything that could be named. He was simply watching a boy rake leaves in the wind and lose. Then he called for Orrin. Orrin was his valet and had been his valet for 11 years, which meant Orrin had seen him in most of the states a man could occupy. He had seen him drunk at 22 after the night Lady Ross had laughed in his face in the Fenwick garden. He had seen him silent for 3 days after his mother died. He had seen him furious, and he had seen him cold, which was different from furious in the way that a blade left in ice is different from one held in fire. The ice blade cuts cleaner. Orrin came in, read the room in one glance the way good valets do, and said nothing. "I need to travel to Millhaven," Ulrich said. "My father." "I'll arrange it for tomorrow morning," Orrin said. "Will you be staying more than 3 days?" "I don't know." Orrin nodded and left. He did not ask about the letter on the desk or the apple beside it, or what had put that particular flatness behind Ulrich's eyes. He simply went to arrange things, because that was what Orrin did, and it was the only comfort Ulrich could accept from anyone without feeling like he was swallowing something wrong. He left for Millhaven the next morning in the grey, lightless hour before sunrise. The roads were still soft from the previous week's rain, and the carriage moved slowly through a landscape that felt submerged, everything dark and wet and quiet in a way that had no warmth in it at all. Ulrich sat with the letter in his coat pocket and did not read it again. He did not need to. He had every word of it already. His father was asleep when he arrived, which was both a mercy and its own particular grief. The man in the bed looked like a rough draft of the father he remembered, smaller, the skin closer to the bone. The hands that had always seemed capable of anything now folded on top of the coverlet like something that had been left there by accident. Ulrich sat in the chair beside the bed. He did not take his coat off. He sat in the chair and looked at his father's hands and thought about the letter, and about the name in it, and about what it meant that a man who was dying had used his remaining strength to arrange the life of the son he was leaving behind. When his father woke, it was mid-afternoon, and the light through the curtains was the color of old paper. "You came," his father said. His voice was thin but steady, which was the worst kind of voice. It meant he had enough left to be clear. "You wrote a letter," Ulrich said. "I did." "You arranged a marriage contract." "I did." Ulrich said nothing for a moment. Outside, somewhere distant, a dog was barking, and then it stopped and the silence was complete. "You could have spoken to me," Ulrich said. His father looked at him with eyes that had grown very calm in these last months, the way water goes calm when it gets very deep. "Would you have agreed?" The honest answer was no. Ulrich was 31 years old. He had been 31 years old for 7 months. He had managed the Voss estate for 4 years while his father's health declined, had managed it well. had increased the income and repaired the north wing, and settled 3 of the tenant disputes that had festered for a decade before he took the reins. He had done all of this without a wife, without any desire for a wife, and with a specific and well-founded aversion to the particular vulnerability that came with allowing a woman into his life at close range. Lady Ross had seen to that. "The estate needs an heir," his father said. "I am dying, these are facts." "I'm aware of the facts." "Then you're aware of what the facts require." Aldrich stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the Millhaven garden, which was nothing like the Voss gardens, and had always been a little overgrown and a little wild in a way his father loved and his mother had tolerated. He stood there and breathed through his nose and told himself he was a reasonable man. "Tell me about the girl," he said. His father was quiet for a moment. "She's 24, sensible by all accounts. Her mother died when she was 12. She's been running the Callow house since she was 15, managing the estate and looking after her younger sister. Lord Callow is not a practical man." "That's a recommendation of her capability, not her character." "Her character," his father said slowly, "is that she agreed to this arrangement knowing full well what it was. She was not deceived. Callow told her, she said yes." Aldrich turned. Why would she say yes to a marriage contract with a man she has never met? His father looked at him for a long moment without answering, and in that silence Aldrich heard what wasn't being said. She said yes because she had reasons of her own, because she needed something from this arrangement as much as his father did, because people who agree to arrangements they have not chosen always have a reason that is larger than themselves. He thought about that the entire ride back to the Voss estate. He thought about a woman who had been running a household since she was 15 and had said yes to a stranger. He thought about what kind of life produced that kind of yes. He arrived home at night when the house was quiet and lit only at the entrance, the rest of it dark and enormous and his. He stood in the front hall for a moment and looked at it. 300 years of Voss, every room he had walked through as a boy, the particular creak on the 7th stair, the smell of the library in autumn, something between dust and wood smoke and the faint ghost of his mother's perfume. The wolfhounds, Breck and Doss, who came clicking across the stone floor to press their heavy heads against his thighs, requiring nothing from him except his presence. He stood there with his hands on the dogs' heads and looked at the house that was going to have a stranger in it. He did not sleep well that night. He wrote his reply to his father's letter in the morning. 3 sentences. He would honor the arrangement. He required a meeting with Lady Seraphine Callow before any contracts were signed. He would receive her at the Voss estate at her earliest convenience. He signed it without reading it back. 3 weeks later, his father died on a Tuesday evening in the room where he had been born, with his housekeeper and his cook and Aldrich beside him, the dogs lying outside the door as if they understood the gravity of rooms they were not allowed in. It was a quiet death, which was the kind his father would have chosen. He had always been a quiet man, a man of arrangements and plans and letters sent on Wednesdays. The funeral was private, the notices went out. The estate formally passed to Aldrich, which it had informally been for years, and the weight of it settled on him the way weight always does when it becomes official. Not heavier, just more real. A month after the funeral, he received word from Lord Callow that his daughter would arrive at the Voss estate on the 14th of October. She would come with a maid, a single trunk and her father, who would stay one night and then return to Staffordshire, as if delivering a parcel and leaving before anyone could ask him to explain what was inside. Aldrich read the word and put it in the drawer of his desk where he kept things he was not ready to look at directly. He told Orrin. He told Mrs. Holt, who was the Voss housekeeper and a woman of formidable organization and very few facial expressions. Mrs. Holt received the news the way she received all news, with a nod and a mental inventory of what needed to be done. A room prepared, the east wing aired, extra staff considered for the additional demands of a household that was about to double in its social obligations. "The blue room?" Mrs. Holt asked. She always asked about the room first. "The blue room," Aldrich agreed. The blue room was the second largest in the east wing. It was not the room that had been his mother's, which was the largest and which Aldrich had not entered in 4 years. It was a good room, a fine room. It had its own sitting area and a window that looked over the formal garden, and in the morning the light came through it at a particular angle that turned everything in the room briefly gold. He had chosen it because it was good. He had not chosen it to be kind. He told himself that clearly. This was a practical arrangement. The room was a practical necessity. Nothing about the choice should be interpreted as anything warmer than practicality. He spent the 2 weeks before her arrival doing what he always did, which was work. He reviewed the tenant agreements. He corresponded with his solicitor about the formal transfer of a border property that had been tied up in a dispute for 18 months. He rode the south fields and the north pasture and checked in with Perrin, his head groom, about the horses. Perrin was a lean man with a weathered face and the particular economy of speech that comes from spending most of a life around animals rather than people. He told Aldrich that the young bay they called Wick was coming along well, that the mare Floret had recovered from her leg and would be ready for riding by spring. Aldrich stood in the stable and listened to Perrin talk about the horses and felt, briefly, the only genuine ease he had felt in weeks. The horses did not care about contracts or arrangements or the name Seraphine Callow. They cared about whether the hay was dry and whether the person standing in front of them smelled like someone worth knowing. Breck and Doss had already made their judgment of him years ago and renewed it daily. The horses were the same. He wished, briefly and without any real expectation, that people were that simple. On the morning of the 14th of October, the sky was the color of pewter, and there was a wind coming off the north fields that had teeth in it. Aldrich stood in the front hall at 9 in the morning and waited. He had not planned to wait in the hall. He had planned to be in his study when they arrived and be summoned, which was the appropriate way for a man in his position to receive visitors in a situation that was not, technically, his choice. But he found himself in the hall anyway. He told himself it was because he had been passing through. He had been passing through for 40 minutes. The carriage came through the gate at 9:30. He watched it from the window beside the door, a dark carriage with the Callow crest on the door which he recognized from the letter and from a distant, dusty memory of the hunt 6 years ago. It came up the drive slowly, which meant the driver was being careful, which meant someone in the carriage had asked him to be careful, and Aldrich filed that away as information without knowing what to do with it. Lord Callow came out first. He was a large man who had gone soft in the middle and red in the face, and he moved with the energy of someone who wanted to be somewhere else. He looked at the Voss estate the way men of his type always looked at things that were grander than their own, which was with a hunger they tried to cover with ease. And then she stepped out. Aldrich had not let himself form an image of her in his mind. He had been very deliberate about that. He had refused the temptation to imagine her as beautiful or plain, sharp-tongued or soft, fragile or capable. He had refused to imagine anything because he knew that whatever he imagined would be wrong, and he preferred to be wrong about nothing. Lady Seraphine Callow was a woman of medium height in a dark blue traveling dress that was well made but not new. Her hair was brown and pulled back without fuss, in the practical way of a woman who had not arranged her appearance for the occasion. Her face was the kind of face that took a moment to read, not striking at first, and then, after the moment, you realized it had stayed with you in a way that more immediately striking faces did not. She looked at the Voss house the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand, which was different from the way her father had looked at it, which was the way a person looks at something they are trying to want. She did not look like someone arriving at a dream. She looked like someone arriving at a decision she had already made and was not going to revisit. Aldrich straightened his coat and opened the door. She looked at him when he came down the steps, and for one moment he had the strange and specific sensation that she was assessing him the way he had just assessed her, which was careful and measuring and without flattery. He was not accustomed to that. He was accustomed to being looked at the way a title is looked at, which is to say with a layer of calculation underneath everything that gets called admiration. She didn't look at him like that. She looked at him like he was a fact she was trying to determine the truth of. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was even and clear, the voice of someone who had been managing rooms full of complicated people for a long time, and had learned that steadiness is the one tool that always works. "Lady Seraphine," he said. They stood on the steps for a moment. Her father was already moving toward the door, already talking about the drive and the road conditions and the quality of the inn where they had stopped last night, already filling the air with the words of a man who cannot tolerate silence. Aldrich looked at Seraphine Callow on his front steps in the October wind and saw, very clearly, that she was not afraid of him. That was the first thing he noticed about her. It would take him a long time to understand why it unsettled him. The tour of the house lasted 40 minutes and was conducted with the same formal efficiency that Aldrich would have given to a business associate inspecting an investment property. He showed her the main hall, the drawing room, the library, the dining room. He named the rooms. He told her what they were used for. He said nothing about the painting in the drawing room that his mother had loved, or the window seat in the library where he had spent most of his childhood reading things he was too young for, or the crack in the dining room plaster that had been there since a disputed party 30 years ago, and that no one had ever properly fixed. Seraphine walked through each room and listened and said very little. Occasionally she asked a practical question. How many staff? Who managed the household accounts? Was there a regular calendar for the formal dinners, or did they occur as occasions demanded? Each question was precise and showed that she had thought about what it would mean to run a house like this before she had ever set foot in it. Aldrich answered each question with equal precision. Lord Callow followed them through the first 3 rooms, made several comments about the quality of the furnishings and the size of the fireplaces, and then drifted away toward the sound of a footman he had spotted with a tray. By the time they reached the library, it was just Aldrich and Seraphine in a room full of books, and the absence of her father's voice made the quiet between them more noticeable than it had been. She stopped in front of the far wall where the older books were kept, the ones that had been his grandfather's, and before that his great-grandfather's, their spines cracked and faded to colors that might once have been red or green, and were now something softer and more ambiguous. She looked at them for a moment without touching them. "These haven't been catalogued," she said. It was not a criticism, it was an observation, but it was also accurate, which was, Aldrich found, slightly annoying. "No," he said, "they haven't." She turned from the shelves. "I'll leave it alone," she said. "I know there are things a person keeps in their current condition because changing them would mean something. I won't assume I know what anything means here yet." He looked at her. "I'm only saying," she continued with the same even tone, "that if there are parts of this house you'd prefer I don't alter or reorganize, it would be more efficient to tell me now than to tell me after I've already done something you object to. And if I said the entire house, then I'd say you don't need a wife, you need a housekeeper." She paused. "Which you already have and who appears to be excellent, so I suspect you don't mean the entire house." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. He was not accustomed to being answered like that. He was accustomed to women who qualified everything, who softened every word until it meant nothing, who answered his questions with other questions designed to find out what answer he preferred so they could provide it. This was not that. "The library," he said, "and the study, and my mother's room in the east wing which is not being used." "All right," she said, "and in return I won't ask you about them." He nodded once. That was the first agreement they made. It was made standing in a library, without a solicitor present, without anyone to witness it, and it held longer and more honestly than most of the official arrangements that came after. Dinner that evening was the kind of dinner that had a particular name, if you were looking for an honest one. It was a performance. Lord Callow ate with the enthusiasm of a man who had not had a proper kitchen at his disposal for some time, which was informative about the Callow household in ways that Aldrich stored carefully. Seraphine ate with the tidiness and attention of a woman who was doing several things at once, including monitoring her father, managing the conversation at her end of the table, and never once looking as though she was doing any of it deliberately. She was very good at it. Aldrich had enough experience with people who were performing to recognize genuine ability, and she had it. Over the soup, Lord Callow announced that his daughter was an accomplished musician. Over the fish, he mentioned that she had managed the Callow house magnificently since her mother passed. Over the lamb, he began a story about Seraphine's childhood that she redirected with a single quiet sentence before he could reach whatever the point of it was going to be. Aldrich watched that particular redirection with interest. It was not the move of a dutiful daughter trying to seem modest. It was the move of a woman who had been managing her father's stories for a long time and knew exactly which ones needed to be turned before they reached a wall. After dinner, Lord Callow retired early, citing his age in the road, and Aldrich and Seraphine were left in the drawing-room with tea and the fire, and a silence that was, for the first time, unhurried. "I should say something," she said after a moment. She was sitting with her hands around her cup, not looking at him but at the fire. "I would rather say it plainly now than have it sitting between us unsaid." "Say it." "I know this is not what you chose," she said. I know it was your father's arrangement, not yours. I know you agreed to honor it because he was dying, and because there are things a person agrees to for a dying father even when they would not agree to them otherwise. I'm not going to pretend I don't know that, or behave as though I think you wanted this." Aldrich was very still. "I also know," she continued, "that my agreement to this arrangement may seem strange to you. A woman who says yes to a contract with an unknown man. I'm not going to explain it tonight. What I will say is that I came here with intentions, not romantic intentions, practical ones. I intend to be useful in this house and to manage what needs to be managed and to stay out of the parts of your life that don't require me. I'm not going to perform happiness I don't have, and I'm not going to make demands you haven't offered to meet. I think that's honest, and I think honest is more useful to you than charming right now." She finally looked at him. "If you'd like me to leave," she said, "I'll leave in the morning with my father and you can write to whoever needs to be written to and we'll say it was a poor match and leave it there. I won't be ruined by it. I've managed worse." The last 3 words were the only ones she said, without complete control over her voice. "I've managed worse." She said it in exactly the same tone as everything before it, and it landed on him like something dropped from a height. He thought about the girl who had been running a household at 15. He thought about what she'd managed in the years since. He thought about Lord Callow across the table, refilling his glass, laughing at his own story about the inn. "You won't leave," Aldrich said. She looked at him. "Not because I'm refusing you the option," he said. "Because you already decided before you came. You aren't asking me to change your mind. You're giving me the chance to change mine." Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, something more like recognition, as if he had said a true thing that she had not expected him to notice. "Yes," she said. "Then we'll do this," he said. "We'll be honest with each other. I won't pretend to want what I didn't ask for, and you won't pretend that this is something it isn't. But we will conduct ourselves with appropriate respect, both in this house and in public, because there are staff and tenants and a community that depends on this estate, and I will not have it disrupted by a marriage that looks like a war." "Agreed," she said. "The wedding will be in 3 weeks when the contracts are settled. Small ceremony, local church, no celebration beyond what courtesy requires." "Agreed." "I will not," he said, and here he paused and chose his next words with the same precision he used for tenant agreements, "treat you unkindly. I will not be cruel or dismissive or publicly cold in a way that humiliates you. You will have the authority of the position you're taking. The staff will defer to you in household matters. You'll have full access to the household accounts." She was very still. "I'm telling you what I can offer," he said. "I'm not offering warmth. I don't know if I can get there from here. But I can offer you fairness and I can offer you the reality of the position." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire moved and the shadows shifted, and outside the wind was doing something impolite to the rose bushes by the east wall. "That's more than I was expecting," she said quietly. "I want you to know that." He didn't answer. He wasn't sure what answer was appropriate to that, and he had spent 31 years learning that the times when he wasn't sure of the appropriate response were the times he should say nothing at all. They drank the rest of the tea in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that has been negotiated and agreed to and therefore sits between people without needing to be fixed. Lord Callow left the next morning as promised, after a breakfast where he ate an impressive quantity of eggs, and said numerous things about the quality of the estate and the good fortune of his daughter and the deep and lasting friendship between the Callow and the Voss families, a friendship that Aldrich was fairly certain had previously consisted of 1 shared hunt and 2 letters. Seraphine kissed her father's cheek at the carriage door and said something to him quietly that Aldrich did not try to hear. Whatever she said, Lord Callow looked briefly uncomfortable, then nodded, and then climbed into the carriage and was gone. She stood at the end of the drive and watched the carriage until it turned through the gate and disappeared. She stood there for a moment after it was gone, and Aldrich stood in the doorway and did not hurry her. She turned and came back up the drive, and when she came through the door her face was settled and composed, and the only evidence of what she was feeling was that she walked straight to the library without asking where it was, which meant she had memorized the route from the night before, and wanted a room where she could be alone with something reliable. He let her go. Mrs. Holt appeared at his elbow the way Mrs. Holt always appeared, which was as if she had been there all along and you simply hadn't noticed. She's been looking at the household schedule, Mrs. Holt said. She asked about the column that was incorrect in the October accounts. I told her I'd been meaning to look at it for a week. Aldrich looked at his housekeeper. She found it in 10 minutes, Mrs. Holt said. I thought you should know. He thought about the library, about the uncatalogued books, about a woman who had been managing a household since she was 15. The wedding was 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in November when the frost was thick on the churchyard grass, and the breath of the 7 people attending made small clouds in the cold air. The vicar was a pleasant man who spoke the ceremony with the focus of someone performing a professional service well. Seraphine wore a grey dress that was, again, well-made and not new, and she stood beside Aldrich at the altar with the posture of a woman who had decided something and was not reversing the decision. He put the ring on her finger. Her hand was very still. They walked out into the frost, and someone, he thought it was Gil, the young footman, had scattered dried rose petals on the path, which was more sentiment than Aldrich had arranged for and which he suspected was Mrs. Holt's doing. Seraphine looked down at the petals on the frost. She looked up. She said nothing, but the set of her face changed very slightly in a way that Aldrich did not have the vocabulary for and which he stored, without understanding why, as something he intended to think about later. He did not think about it later. He told himself there was nothing to think about. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a great many things in those first weeks, and the interesting part was that none of them made sounds when they broke. They simply shifted slowly, the way ice shifts in early spring, making no noise at all until the moment it gives way entirely. That moment was not yet. That moment was still a long way off. But it had already started. And the man who had decided he did not want this, the man who had agreed to it only because the dead require things of us that the living never could, that man was already being undone by very small things he had not thought to guard against. A woman who found an accounting error in 10 minutes. A woman who looked at a house like she was trying to understand it. A woman who said I've managed worse and did not explain what she meant. He was not, he told himself firmly, curious about her. He was simply noticing things. A man in his position was required to notice things. It was, he told himself, simply good sense. Outside, the frost was melting in the morning sun, and the rose petals the footman had scattered were beginning to darken at their edges, beautiful and brief and already passing. The first month of the marriage was, in the technical sense, a success. No one in the house was unhappy, no one was confused about their responsibilities, and no incident occurred that required explanation or apology from either party. Aldrich had set the terms clearly, and Seraphine had accepted them completely, which meant the house functioned the way a good clock functions, each piece doing its assigned work, each hand moving in its correct direction. Mrs. Holt reported at the end of the first week that the new Duchess had completed a full review of the household accounts and identified 2 additional discrepancies that had been sitting unnoticed since the summer. She had not made a production of the discovery. She had simply left a neat note on the housekeeper's desk listing the relevant line items and the likely source of each error, signed with her initials, and expected no reply. Mrs. Holt, who had been maintaining those accounts for 16 years, and had never had a mistress of the house notice anything in them before, spent a full minute staring at the note before she filed it. She told Aldrich about it with the same carefully neutral expression she used for everything, but he had known her long enough to hear what was underneath it. She was impressed. She would never say so in a way that could be quoted back to her, but she was. Seraphine also made herself known to each member of the staff in the first week, in the practical, unhurried way of someone who understood that a household is a set of relationships and relationships require attention. She learned their names without being introduced twice. She asked questions about their work with the kind of genuine interest that was different from the polite curiosity employers sometimes performed, and the staff noticed the difference, because people always know the difference, even when they don't have words for it. Gil, the young footman, was the first to visibly warm to her. He was 19 and earnest and made small errors that his predecessor had been roundly criticized for, and Seraphine corrected each one so quietly that he didn't realize he had been corrected until later, and by then it had the feeling of learning something rather than being caught. Nell, the laundry girl who had appointed herself the keeper of opinions in the below-stairs world, said at the end of the second week that the new Duchess was all right. This was, from Nell, the equivalent of a formal commendation. Aldrich observed all of this from a distance he had chosen deliberately and maintained like a boundary fence. He was in the house. He was at the table for dinner on the evenings he was not committed elsewhere. He was present for the appearances that the position required, but he had structured his days so that their contact was limited, purposeful, and free of the kind of intimacy that breeds complications. He had done this before, kept himself arranged at a safe remove from things that had the potential to cost him something. He was very good at it. It was, in fact, the thing he was best at in the world. He told himself that everything was going well. He told himself that so often, and with such conviction that it was almost true. The Fenwicks had been hosting their winter dinner party every December for 11 years, and they had never once done it quietly. Lord Fenwick was a man who believed that social gatherings existed to demonstrate the quality of his wine cellar and the breadth of his acquaintance, and Lady Fenwick was a woman who executed his ambitions with the competence of a general and the smile of someone who had made her peace with the job. Together they produced the most reliably performed event in the county, which was not the same thing as the most enjoyed, but which everyone attended anyway because attendance was not optional. Aldrich had received the invitation, as he received it every year, and had accepted as he accepted every year, because not accepting was a statement, and he had no desire to make statements about the Fenwicks. This year the invitation was addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Voss, which was new, and which Lord Fenwick had underlined with a small flourish that was possibly innocent and possibly not. He told Seraphine about the dinner 2 days before. They were in the study at the time, she having come to ask a question about the Eastern tenants' rent schedule and stayed briefly, because the question had generated a secondary question that turned into a conversation about land management that lasted 20 minutes and was, Aldrich thought afterward, the most naturally sustained conversation they had yet had. "The Fenwicks," she said when he mentioned it. "I know of them. Lady Fenwick is a cousin of Mrs. Brindley who knew my mother." "Then you'll have something to talk about." She gave him a look that was not quite amusement. "I always have something to talk about," she said. "That's the easy part of these things." He looked at her. "The difficult part," she said, "is knowing which conversation to be having while you're having the official one." He understood what she meant, and he was briefly startled that she had said it so directly. Social events in his world were layered like geology. On the surface, conversation about weather and horses and mutual acquaintances. Underneath that, the real business, information being exchanged, alliances being signaled, positions being established or challenged, all of it conducted in a language that required years of immersion to speak fluently. He had been fluent in it since childhood. He had not considered that she might be fluent in it too. They arrived at the Fenwick house in a carriage that had been prepared with more ceremony than usual, Orrin having decided that certain occasions required a certain kind of presentation, and the specific look of a new duchess at her first formal appearance in county society was not the occasion on which to cut corners. Seraphine wore a dark green dress that was, for the first time since he had met her, new, and it fit her with the precision of something made for her specifically, which suggested she had arranged it in the weeks since the wedding without mentioning it. She looked in the carriage like a woman who had decided to arrive somewhere and had therefore dressed for the arrival. It was a different look from the blue traveling dress and the gray wedding dress. It was the look of a choice. He noticed it the way he noticed everything she did, which was carefully and without acknowledgement. The Fenwick entrance hall was full of people arranged in the specific informal formations of a gathering that would not admit to having a hierarchy, but was in fact organized entirely around one. Aldrich moved through it the way he always moved through such things, with a fluency born of long practice and genuine indifference to most of what was said to him, responding with exactly the right amount of interest and exactly the right amount of reserve, managing the social current without being carried by it. Beside him, Seraphine did the same thing, but differently. He was managing from the outside, he realized. From a position of authority that kept the current at a distance. She was moving through it from the inside. She was engaged, genuinely engaged, with each person she spoke to, but in a way that was also completely in control, the way a very skilled swimmer controls a strong current by moving with it rather than against it. Lady Fenwick found them after the first quarter hour and was, as Aldrich had expected, charming in the manner of someone who had made a study of charm and was deploying it purposefully. "Your Grace," she said to Seraphine, with the warmth that told Aldrich she was already assessing every detail, "We are so very pleased you've come. I understand you're a cousin of Mrs. Brindley's." "She knew my mother," Seraphine said. "I haven't seen her in some years." "Is she well?" She is, though she couldn't make it this evening. I'm sure she'll call on you before the new year." Lady Fenwick smiled the smile of a woman who files information. "You must find the Voss estate quite a change from Staffordshire." "It's a good house," Seraphine said simply. Something about the way she said it made Lady Fenwick pause for just half a second, the way a person pauses when they expected a door to swing wide and it moved only an inch. She recovered and smiled and moved on to the introductions of the other guests, and Aldrich, who had been standing just slightly behind Seraphine's left shoulder, thought, "A good house." Not "it is magnificent," not "I am so fortunate," not "the gardens are extraordinary." A good house. It was not a performance of contentment, and it was not a performance of dissatisfaction. It was simply true, and because it was simply true, it contained nothing that could be used. Dinner was 12 at the table, the Fenwicks having exercised their usual preference for intimate intimidation over grand impersonal spectacle. Aldrich was at Lady Fenwick's right. Seraphine was placed across and 3 seats down between Lord Meridew, who was 70 and interested only in cattle breeding, and a woman named Mrs. Dove, who was 45 and interested in everything that was anyone else's business. He watched without appearing to watch, because he had been watching her since October and had developed a talent for it. Mrs. Dove had a method. She asked questions that were technically social niceties, and were in fact information-gathering instruments of some precision. Aldrich had been subjected to Mrs. Dove's method on 2 separate occasions, and had responded each time with such perfectly calibrated blandness that she had given up after 6 minutes, which was, for Mrs. Dove, essentially an admission of defeat. He watched Seraphine's face as Mrs. Dove began her work. Seraphine listened. She asked a question back. She listened to the answer. She said something that made Mrs. Dove laugh, genuinely the kind of laugh a person produces when they have been genuinely surprised into amusement. Mrs. Dove said something. Seraphine smiled. 3 minutes in, Mrs. Dove was talking about herself. Her own household, her own husband's recent health concerns, her daughter's upcoming engagement that was not yet officially announced but was being discussed in her immediate family. She was talking about herself, and she had clearly not intended to do anything of the kind, and she was doing it because Seraphine had asked the exact right question at the exact right moment in a tone that made telling her things seem like the natural choice. By the soup course, Mrs. Dove was Seraphine's closest friend at the table. Aldrich turned his attention back to Lady Fenwick and said something appropriate about the recent improvements to the county road, and underneath the appropriate thing, he was doing a private and specific revision of everything he had assumed about his wife in the weeks since they had arrived at the same arrangement and agreed to leave each other in peace. He had thought she was competent. He had thought she was efficient. He had thought she was the sort of woman who managed practical things well and left the social things as an obligation to be endured. He had been wrong about the last part. She was not enduring the social things. She was operating in them like a woman who had grown up in that particular water and had learned to breathe in it early, before she was old enough to know it was supposed to be difficult. After dinner, during the ritual hour in which the men were separated and subjected to Lord Fenwick's port and Lord Fenwick's opinions, Aldrich learned nothing of particular interest and endured it with his usual combination of selective attention and well-timed commentary. When they were permitted to rejoin the women in the drawing room, he found Seraphine in the far corner, where she had apparently been drawn into a conversation with 2 women he did not know, and from whose company she extracted herself with easy grace the moment she saw him cross the room. They were preparing to leave, coats and carriages being retrieved, when a voice said his name from the direction of the doorway, a particular voice, the kind of voice that, even after 4 years, landed in a specific region of his chest that he preferred not to acknowledge. Lady Ross. She was still beautiful. She had always been beautiful in the way that very deliberate people are beautiful, the beauty not an accident but a carefully managed project. Her husband was somewhere behind her and did not appear to have noticed the moment, because the moment was visible only to 3 people in the room, and 2 of them were Aldrich and the woman in front of him. The third was Seraphine, who was beside him and had gone very still in the way that people go still when they have read a room correctly and are deciding what to do with the information. "Your Grace," Lady Ross said to him, her smile was exactly what it had always been. "We heard about your marriage, congratulations. Her gaze moved to Seraphine with the precision of a move on a board. "And this must be your new Duchess, how lovely." "Lady Ross," he said. His voice came out exactly as he intended it to, flat and even and giving nothing. Seraphine looked at Lady Ross with the same measured gaze she had turned on him the first day at the steps, the gaze that assessed without flattering, and she smiled with a warmth that was entirely controlled. "I've heard your name," Seraphine said pleasantly. "It's nice to finally put a face to it." Something flickered behind Lady Ross's eyes, something small and very cold. In the carriage on the way home they did not speak about Lady Ross. They spoke about the dinner, about Lord Meridu's extensive opinions on Hereford cattle, about the quality of the Fenwick cook's whey with pastry. The carriage was warm and the night outside was very dark and the horses moved at a steady pace. Aldrich sat across from Seraphine and said nothing about Lady Ross. He had no intention of saying anything about Lady Ross. He had not spoken her name aloud in 4 years and had no plans to break that practice. But somewhere in the middle of the conversation about Hereford cattle, Seraphine said, with the same matter-of-fact tone she used for household accounts, "She still has feelings for you. I thought you should know I noticed, in case it affects how you'd like me to handle future occasions where she's present." Aldrich was very still. "I'm not asking questions," she added. "I'm just offering information. What you do with it is your own business." He looked at her across the carriage in the dark. The lantern light moved with the road and caught the side of her face at intervals, and she was looking out the window at nothing in particular, having said her piece and released it, the way she released most things, cleanly and without clutching. "I've heard your name. It's nice to finally put a face to it." He thought about what that sentence had cost her to say with that particular tone, in that particular moment, to that particular woman. He did not say thank you. He was not sure that was the right word for what he felt, but he was aware, in the cold and moving dark of the carriage, that something had happened in the Fenwick drawing-room that was not in the terms of their arrangement and that he had not known to prepare for. Seraphine went on looking out the window. He went on being a man who was very good at noticing things and doing absolutely nothing about them. But the night moved past and the house came into view, and inside the house the fires had been kept going by the thoughtful Gill, and the dogs came clicking across the stone floor to press themselves against Aldrich's legs, and Seraphine touched Breck's ear briefly in passing, which she did every night now. The same touch each time, brief and specific, and Breck leaned into it, the way dogs lean into a person they have decided is permanent. Aldrich saw this, he filed it, he did not know what to do with it yet. He would eventually. But not tonight. The week after the Fenwick dinner was quiet in the way that weeks are quiet when the things happening inside them are not loud things. Aldrich managed the estate. He wrote 3 letters about the border property dispute that had now officially been resolved in his favor, a victory that should have felt larger and felt instead like the closing of a door that had been left ajar for too long. He rode the Northfields every morning because the cold was clean and the horse didn't talk. Seraphine, meanwhile, was doing something in the East Wing that involved the supply inventory, a set of ledgers she had retrieved from storage, and what appeared to be a systematic reconstruction of how the household's provisions were ordered and tracked. She had not announced this project. She had not asked permission for it. She had simply identified something that needed to be done and begun doing it, which was, he was coming to understand, her primary mode of operation. He passed the small room she was using as a workroom on the second evening. The door was open. She was at the desk with 3 ledgers open around her and a lamp pulled close, and her hair falling slightly out of its arrangement in a way she clearly hadn't noticed. She was writing something in a small, neat hand, and her face held the focused, private expression of someone who is doing a thing they are good at and know it. He did not stop, he walked past. He walked perhaps 4 steps, stopped and walked back. She looked up. She did not look surprised, which was one of the things about her that he was finding increasingly difficult to account for. "The Western Provision Orders," he said. "The miller at Aldgate has been slow since September. If you're reorganizing the supply structure, you should know about it." "I noticed the pattern," she said. "I was going to mention it in the morning. He's been slow because he's been covering a shortfall from the northern farms. I think the better solution is renegotiating the northern purchase quantity rather than changing the miller." He stood in the doorway. "Is that wrong?" she asked. "No," he said, "it's correct." She nodded and returned to the ledger. He stood there for one more moment. He was not sure why. He was not cold. He was not hungry. There was nothing he had come down this corridor to do. And yet he stood in the doorway of a lit room watching his wife work by lamplight and felt the entirely unfamiliar sensation of having nowhere more pressing to be. "The third ledger," he said, "the older one. The entries from before 1847 are in my grandfather's hand and they're sometimes difficult to read. If you can't make out a figure, ask Mrs. Holt. She memorized most of them years ago." Seraphine looked at him again. Something in her face shifted the way it sometimes did, that small, hard-to-name movement, and she said, "Thank you." He left. He told himself he had simply been passing. Oren, who had been with him for 11 years, and had learned to read the specific way the Duke moved through his own house, said nothing at dinner the following evening about the fact that his employer had taken a slightly longer route to the drawing room than was strictly necessary, a route that happened to pass the East Wing workroom. Oren was a very good valet. Some of the best work he did was invisible. Mrs. Holt came to him at the end of that week with the updated inventory summary, which was more organized and more complete than any version he had seen before. She laid it on his desk and stood back. "Shall I assume this will be the new format going forward?" she asked. He looked at the clean, efficient columns, the notes in the margin, the projection figures for January purchasing. "Yes," he said, "this format." Mrs. Holt nodded once and left, and if there was something knowing in the set of her shoulders as she went, Aldrich chose not to see it. Outside, the December cold had settled in properly, the kind of cold that makes sound travel further and gives the air a brittle, particular quality, as though it might crack if struck. The dogs preferred the fireside now and were increasingly selective about which outdoor excursions were worth their participation. Breck had begun sleeping in the corridor outside Seraphine's door, which was new. Dogs are almost never wrong about people. Aldrich had known that for a long time. He looked at the inventory summary on his desk. He looked at the careful columns and the neat hand, and the correct solution to the Aldgate provision problem that she had identified from a pattern in a ledger. He was not, he reminded himself, curious about her. He was simply managing his household. The inventory said otherwise. The chapel was at the far end of the east garden, past the kitchen wall and the old apple store that had not been used for apples in 20 years, down a flagstone path that the frost made treacherous by the third week of December. It was a small building, 1 room, 8 pews, a plain window that let in north light, cold and white and unadorned. His grandmother had used it. His mother had used it. Then it had been empty for 4 years, and the emptiness of it had been so complete that Aldrich had almost stopped remembering it was there. He learned about the chapel visits from Gil. Not because Gil told him directly. Gil was not a man who told the Duke things. He was a man who told Mrs. Holt things, and Mrs. Holt was a woman who told the Duke very selectively the things she thought he needed to know, and she had decided, apparently, that this was one of them. "The young Duchess has been going to the chapel in the mornings," Mrs. Holt said, in the same voice she used to report that the east gutters needed attention. "Before breakfast. I thought you should know, in case you'd want the path gridded against the frost." He had the path gridded. He told himself it was for the safety of the path. It was a stone path and it was December, and people broke bones on stone paths in December. It was a practical decision. He made the decision without thinking about who was walking the path or why, or what a woman went to a chapel for before the sun was fully up. He made it without any of that. He went for a ride the next morning at 5:30, which was earlier than he usually rode, and which could be attributed to the fact that he had not slept well, and which could not be attributed to any interest in the path to the east garden or in what was happening in the small building at the end of it. He did not ride past the chapel. He rode past the east garden because it was on the way to the north pasture, and the north pasture was where he was going, and the path past the east garden was the direct route, and there was nothing unusual about it. As he passed, he saw the chapel door was slightly open, the way a door is left open when someone inside wants a thread of cold air and is not concerned about the temperature because they are not thinking about temperature. He rode on, he did not stop. But he counted, without intending to, the number of steps from the path he was on to the chapel door. 43. It was the kind of number you count without knowing you are counting and only understand later that you have stored it. He rode to the north pasture. Perrin was already there, which was not unusual because Perrin was always early. A man who seemed to exist most fully in the hour before other people were awake, and who performed his best thinking among horses in the cold. They checked on Wick. The young bay was 2 years old, bright-eyed and particular in his preferences, the kind of horse who had strong opinions about which humans were worth his time. He had decided Aldrich was worth his time in September, and he had made a similar decision about Seraphine in November. On the one occasion she had come to the stables and offered her hand with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who had known horses before. Perrin had mentioned that. He had mentioned it in the same voice he used for horse-related assessments, which was more honest than any other kind. She knows horses, Perrin had said just that, and it had the weight of a formal endorsement. Aldrich stood in the cold of the north pasture and watched Wick move across the frost-stiff ground and thought about 43 steps. He thought about a chapel door left slightly open. He thought about what it meant that a woman got up before dawn and walked down a gridded path to a cold room and sat in it. He had a theory, he pushed the theory away. He did not have the right to theories about his wife's private life, which was precisely what the chapel was, private. He had agreed to that. He had been the one to offer the terms that included the specific provision of not asking about each other's boundaries. He went back to the house. He checked the household calendar on his way through the front hall, which he did every morning and which was therefore not unusual, and he noted that the calendar was now maintained in Seraphine's hand, a hand he recognized from the provision ledgers, small and neat and precise. She had noted which days required him to attend things that she would also need to attend. She had noted which days were his to manage entirely without reference to her. She had done this without asking him, because she had apparently been paying enough attention to know his schedule, and because she considered that kind of consideration to be the minimum baseline of the arrangement, not something worth remarking on. He stood in the front hall looking at a calendar in his wife's handwriting and felt something that had no comfortable name. The feeling arrived at the same time as the realization that it had been arriving, incrementally, for 6 weeks, and that he had been filing it under various practical headings because the practical headings were easier. He was good at the practical headings. He walked to his study and sat down and looked at the correspondence waiting for him, and picked up the first letter and put it down and picked it up again. The letter was from his solicitor about a property matter that had nothing to do with Seraphine or chapels or calendar handwriting. It required his attention. He gave it his attention. He was very thorough about it. He revised the letter 3 times, which was unusual, and each revision was technically an improvement, but also, he understood, an exercise in staying busy, staying in the practical headings, staying in the territory where he knew the geography and the rules and could be confident of his footing. Orrin came in at 10 with coffee and the secondary mail. "The path to the east garden looks better," Orrin said, setting the tray down. He said it in the voice of a man remarking on a household improvement with no additional meaning. "The frost," Aldrich said. "Yes," Orrin said. "The frost." Neither of them said anything else about it. In the evenings, Aldrich and Seraphine continued to have dinner together. These dinners had evolved from the formal, careful affairs of the first 2 weeks into something slightly less formal, though not, he was careful to note, less considered. They talked about the estate, about the tenant who was having a difficult winter, about a book she had taken from the library that turned out to be his grandfather's journal of a property dispute in 1821, which she had found interesting and he had never read, about the question of whether the Northfield drainage needed addressing in spring or could wait another season. They did not talk about Lady Ross. They did not talk about the chapel. They did not talk about her father or what she had left behind in Staffordshire. They had agreed on certain silences, and the silences were, in their way, as informative as the conversations. He knew she received letters from Staffordshire on Tuesdays. He knew she wrote back on Wednesdays. He knew the letters were from her sister Myra, because she had mentioned Myra's name once in passing, and he had stored it with the same instinct that stored everything about her now automatically, without decision. She never offered what the letters said, he never asked. But on the Tuesday evening after the chapel visits began, she came to dinner with a look he had not seen before. Not grief exactly, something held in careful check that was adjacent to it. She ate and she talked and she did everything she normally did, and under all of it was this contained thing that she was not letting out. He noticed. He said nothing. But when she rose to leave after dinner and said good night at the door, he said, without fully planning to, "The letters from Staffordshire. I hope everything is well." She stopped, she turned. "My sister is fine," she said. "She worries about me. I try to write in a way that stops her worrying without lying to her, which is more complicated than it sounds." "Yes," he said, "it usually is." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Is there someone you write to like that? Someone you're trying not to worry?" He thought of his father, and then he thought of the absence where his father had been, the empty address in Millhaven, the particular silence of a correspondence that no longer had a recipient. "No," he said, "not any more." She received that and did not press it and said good night again and left. He heard her footsteps on the stairs. He heard the particular cadence of them, which he had learned the way you learn the sounds of a house, not by trying but by being present. He sat for a while with the empty dinner table and the fire going down, and the dogs shifting in their sleep by the hearth. 43 steps. He had not looked into the window, he had not slowed down. He had ridden past at a normal pace, and not changed anything about his posture or direction or the way his eyes moved over the landscape. But he had counted, and the number was in him now, and he did not know what to do with it yet, and the not knowing was itself a new sensation, because he was a man who always knew what to do with things. He put out the lamp. He did not sleep for a long time. Outside the cold settled deeper, and the stars over the north pasture were very clear and very cold, and indifferent to the particular small reckoning happening in the house below them, which was a man slowly understanding that he had agreed to a distance he was no longer certain he wanted to maintain. The days continued to shorten in the way December days do, each one giving up the light a little earlier until the afternoons were already dimming by 3. In this compressing light, the house acquired a different quality. The spaces between rooms felt smaller. The evenings lasted longer. The fire in the drawing room, which Seraphine had taken over managing from the footmen in a quiet reorganization he had noticed but not mentioned, burned better than it ever had before, she having identified that the grate was drawing poorly because of a partially blocked flue. She had sorted out the flue on a Tuesday while Aldrich was meeting with his solicitor. He came home to a drawing room that was noticeably warmer, and she mentioned it at dinner in 3 sentences and returned to talking about the northern farms. He thought about that for a longer time than was reasonable. There was a thing that was happening in this house that he did not yet have language for, and the lack of language was making him aware of the thing the way the absence of a sound makes you suddenly conscious of silence. She was not pursuing him. She had said she wouldn't, and she meant it, and every day she demonstrated that she meant it by being exactly what she had offered to be on the first night. Useful, present, honest, and entirely free of the kind of maneuvering that he had learned to watch for in women who wanted things from him. She didn't seem to want things from him. She wanted from the house and the estate and the work, and she took those things by doing them, but she did not want from him. And here was the thing that was not comfortable. He had built his entire defensive structure on the assumption that women always wanted things from him. It was the assumption that had saved him after Lady Ross. It was the assumption that had kept him clean and efficient and safe for 4 years. It was the assumption on which his terms of this marriage had been constructed. Seraphine appeared not to have received the notice that this was the assumption. He rode past the chapel again on Thursday morning at the same early hour. The door was open again, the same thin thread of light through the same slightly parted door. He did not stop, he did not slow down. He counted 43 steps. He counted them again. He kept riding. He told himself with great conviction that none of this was anything. And the conviction was entirely sincere and also entirely wrong, and some part of him, the part that was his father's son and had learned from his father the particular cost of recognizing true things too late, that part knew it. He did not listen to that part yet. He would eventually, but the eventually was still ahead of him, still waiting in the future that he could not see but was walking toward nonetheless, one early morning and one counted step at a time. The Christmas season arrived, and with it a series of obligations that required them to appear together in public on 3 separate occasions in 2 weeks. They managed this with the same practical competence they had brought to the Fenwick dinner, she handling the social geometry of the events with a skill that still surprised him each time he saw it fresh, and him providing the authority of position, and the name and the general manner that his station had trained him to produce on demand. They were good together in public, that was the objective fact of it. They did not perform closeness. They simply occupied the same social space with a fluency that people read as ease, because it was easy, in the way that things are easy when the two people involved have decided not to fight each other. A woman at the December assembly said to Lady Fenwick, within Aldrich's range of hearing, that the new Duchess of Voss was not at all what one might have expected. Lady Fenwick, who had been watching Seraphine at work all evening with an assessment that had moved from skepticism to something more respectful, had replied that she was exactly what one would have expected if one had been paying proper attention. Aldrich heard both remarks. He filed them separately. On the last day of December, he came down at midnight and found the drawing-room fire still going. He had come down for a book, the mild insomnia that visited him occasionally having struck that night, and the book he wanted was in the drawing-room, and the fire was lit, and Seraphine was asleep in the chair beside it. She was asleep with a letter in her lap, the letter from Staffordshire, he thought. Tuesday's letter that she had likely been reading and rereading in the way you reread letters that say things you need to sit with. The fire had gone low but was not out. The room was warm. Breck was at her feet, as if he had appointed himself guardian of the chair, his large head resting on his paws with the contentment of a dog who had chosen his allegiance. Aldrich stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about waking her. He thought about leaving. He thought about the letter in her lap and what it might say, and the look she had had at dinner on Tuesday, and the thing she had said about writing without lying. He put a log on the fire without making much noise. The fire came back up and the room brightened, and Breck opened one eye and then closed it again, his security assessment apparently satisfied. He took the book he had come for. He looked at her one more time in the warmth of the renewed fire, the letter in her lap and her face relaxed in a way it wasn't when she was awake, the management and the competence and the careful composure all set aside, just a woman asleep in a chair, and whatever she was carrying in the letter, she was carrying it even in sleep, because her hand was still closed around the page. He left the fire going and the room warm and went back upstairs. In the morning she said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. But there was something in the way she looked at the drawing-room fire at breakfast, which was burning more than it should have given the time of day, and then looked at him briefly, that suggested she had worked out what had happened. She said nothing. Neither did he. But the log was in the fire, and the fire was warm, and these were facts that could not be taken back, and both of them knew it. January was the month of Wick. The young bay had been showing signs of weakness in the last week of December. Perrin mentioned it first. In the careful, understated way, he mentioned all horse-related concerns, which was by stating the fact, and then going quiet and watching to see if the fact landed properly. Aldrich had been out to the stable 3 times in the week before Christmas to check on Wick himself. He had stood in the stall with the horse and run his hands down the animal's neck and legs and looked at him and not liked what he saw, and had said as much to Perrin, and Perrin had said that he had sent for the horse doctor from the village, and that they were watching. They watched for 10 days. The horse doctor came twice. He was not encouraging. On the 12th of January, on a morning that was very cold and very still, with the kind of white sky that looks like it has been wrung out of color, Perrin came to the house and asked for the Duke. Aldrich was in the study. He went to the stable. He knew before he got there. Wick was lying down, which was not a thing Wick did by choice. He was a horse who preferred to stand, who found horizontal undignified and chose it only when he had no election. He was lying down now, his sides moving with the effort of breathing, his eye finding Aldrich when he came into the stall, and holding that contact with the particular look that horses give when they are beyond the stage of asking for things, and have arrived at the stage of simply being with someone. Aldrich crouched down beside him. He put his hand on the bay's neck. The horse was warm, not the warm of an animal in good health, the other kind. Perrin stood at the stall door and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not already understood. It took another 2 hours. Aldrich stayed. He had left the study in the middle of the tenant correspondence which would need to be done before Friday, and he had come here instead, and he stayed through the white morning in the cold stable with his hand on a horse who was dying, because the horse was dying and that required witness. He had learned that from his mother. She had said, when her own father died and Aldrich was 7 and did not understand what death required, Some things need to be seen all the way through. It is the only useful thing the living can offer the dying. He had thought of it at his father's bedside. He thought of it now. When it was over, Perrin handled the necessary things with the quiet competence of a man who had been through this before, which he had, more times than he counted. Aldrich stood outside the stable door in the white January morning and breathed the cold air and did not do anything particular with his face, because there was no one watching and therefore no particular need to manage it. He was not aware that he was wrong about that. He heard the door from the house open and close, which was a small sound that the cold air carried further than it usually would. He did not turn around. He heard footsteps on the frost, careful ones, and then the footsteps stopped. He still did not turn around. "Perrin told me," Seraphine said from somewhere behind his left shoulder. Her voice was quiet, not the kind of quiet that is being kept down, the kind that is chosen because the moment requires it. He said nothing. She did not press him to. She did not ask if he was all right. She did not say she was sorry, which was the right thing to say in most circumstances and the wrong thing to say in this one, because the loss of a horse to a person who knew horses is not a small loss dressed in sentimental clothes. It is a real thing, and it deserves to be treated as a real thing. She knew that. He understood that she knew it. She stood behind him and slightly to his left, not close enough to intrude and not far enough away to be absent, and she did not say anything useful or comforting or performatively appropriate. She was just there. They stood there together in the white cold outside the stable for what was probably 4 minutes and felt like longer and was not uncomfortable. Not even the kind of not uncomfortable that requires management, just two people in the cold, one of them breathing through a loss and the other one staying. Then she went inside. He heard the door, he heard the footsteps retreat. He heard nothing after that because the cold absorbed everything. He stood for a moment more. Then he went back to the study and the tenant correspondence that needed to be done before Friday. At 4 o'clock, Gil appeared at his study door with a tray. The tray held coffee, which was expected, and a plate of something from the kitchen, which was not, because Aldrich did not eat in the study. He looked at the tray. He looked at Gil. "From the Duchess," Gil said, with the look of a young man who is performing errand running, and is also aware that the errand is significant in ways that are above his position to comment on. On the tray there was a note folded once. He opened it, her hand small and precise. It said, "The cook made this for the cold. There is nothing required of you in response." That was all. He read it twice. He ate the thing from the kitchen, which was a kind of dense, warming pastry with herbs in it that the cook made in the deep winter, the kind of food that had been made in cold houses for generations, because it was what cold houses needed. He did not write back. She had said nothing was required, and he had learned to take her at her word. But that evening at dinner he asked, for the first time in the 2 months they had been eating together, about Myra. Not the letters, not what they said. He asked about who she was, what she was like, what she was interested in. He asked the way you ask about someone when you are trying to understand another person's history through the details they're attached to, because the people we love are the map of who we are. Seraphine set down her fork. She looked at him with the look that he had come to associate with moments when he had done something that landed outside the terms she had anticipated. "She's 20, Seraphine said. She reads everything. She's funnier than she looks. She decided at 16 that she wanted to study botany, and our father told her that wasn't a suitable occupation for a woman of her position, and she has spent 4 years doing it anyway, quietly, in the way she does things." "She's like you," he said. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "We learned from the same circumstances," she said. "When you can't change the container, you change what you do inside it." He thought about a girl running a household at 15. He thought about 4 years of managing a father who wasn't managing much of anything. He thought about the look on Seraphine's face when Lord Callow's carriage had gone through the gate in October, and she had stood at the end of the drive alone. He did not say any of this. "Is she well?" he asked. "She is," Seraphine said. "She worries more than she needs to. That's the thing about her I can't fix, no matter how I write the letters." "She worries about you." "She thinks I'm here out of sacrifice," Seraphine said. She said it matter-of-factly, without complaint or self-pity. "She thinks I arranged this to clear the family's debts and give her a better position and take the pressure off a situation that was becoming untenable, and that I was wrong to do it, and she will probably feel guilty about it for longer than she should. She picked up her fork again. She's partly right, Seraphine added without looking at him. About the reasons, not about whether it was wrong. He sat with that for a moment. And the other part, he asked, the part she's wrong about. She looked at him then, directly, the way she sometimes looked at him when she was deciding how much to say. The night my father told me about the arrangement, she said, I asked him 2 questions. The first was about the debts and whether they would be settled. The second was whether the Duke of Voss was reported to be a decent man. He was very still. My father said he didn't know you well. He said your father spoke well of you. He said you'd managed the estate responsibly since taking it over and that there were no stories of cruelty or bad character in the community. She paused. That was enough for me. Not love, not attraction, not hope in the romantic sense, just the assessment that you were someone I could be in a house with without coming to harm. She ate a small bite of something, she chewed it, she swallowed it, and then she said I was right. I'd like Myra to know that eventually, not for me, for her peace of mind. Aldrich looked at his plate. He thought about a 20-year-old girl doing botany in secret, in a house that wasn't being well managed. He thought about the letter in the chair. He thought about you were someone I could be in a house with without coming to harm, and what a specific and terrible and honest bar that was to clear, and how completely it described the world she had been operating in before she arrived here. He thought about Wick, lying down in the cold and Perrin at the door, and the particular kind of staying that is the only useful thing the living can offer. When spring comes, he said, Myra is welcome to visit. The gardens here would suit someone interested in botany. There are a number of documented species on the south grounds that haven't been formally catalogued. He paused. She'd have the run of them. Seraphine set down her fork. She did not say anything for a moment. Thank you, she said. And it was not the same thank you as the one in the library, the one that was polite and professional and keeping the distance right. This one was different. This one had weight in it. The weight of a girl who had been carrying things for a long time and had just been offered the chance to set one of them down. He nodded once. He picked up his fork. He changed the subject back to the estate, something about the February accounts that needed to be reviewed, and she followed him there without requiring him to have said more than he had. But the spring offer was said. It was in the room, it could not be unsaid. And both of them knew, without either of them mentioning it, that the arrangement they had made in October had changed into something that did not yet have a name, but which was no longer nothing. It was becoming something. Slowly, quietly, at the rate of small real things, a note on a tray, a question about a sister, a 2-year-old bay horse who needed to be seen all the way through. Something. February came in grey and persistent, and Aldrich spent most of it managing the aftermath of the estate's annual review, which was the particular month when every deferred decision from the previous year required reckoning. 3 tenant agreements needed revision. The Northfield drainage was, as he had suspected, not able to wait another season. The stable roof over the older section required structural work that he had been putting off for 2 years and could no longer put off. He worked with the systematic focus he brought to all problems that could be reduced to a list of required actions and a calendar. The tenants were spoken to. The drainage engineer was engaged for March. The stable contracts were reviewed and drawn up. Seraphine, in this same period, finalized her reorganization of the household supply systems, met with Mrs. Holt about the spring linen inventory, and wrote what appeared to be a formal proposal about the South Gardens. She presented it to him without ceremony one evening after dinner, a document of 5 pages in her careful hand, outlining a garden restoration program that would address the decades of piecemeal maintenance and bring the formal gardens back to something close to what they had been in his grandmother's time. He read it that night in the study. It was thorough, it was well costed, it cited appropriate sources for the restoration approach. It noted in a small marginal addition that the South grounds contained 11 documented native species that had been catalogued only partially in his grandmother's time, and that a complete botanical survey would be of scientific interest as well as aesthetic value. 11 species, catalogued only partially. He thought about Myra. He thought about botany. He thought about the spring. He wrote a single word in the margin beside the botanical note, yes. He left the document on her breakfast tray in the morning, which was not their usual method of communication, and which she received without comment but with the kind of silence that, from her, was a specific kind of thank you. The ground was still frozen, but the light was beginning to change. February's light is not warm, but it is longer than January's, and the length of it is its own kind of promise. By the middle of the month the birds were doing something in the mornings, a preliminary kind of bird conversation that was not yet full song but was the beginning of it, the way a musician warms up in the wings before the performance. Aldrich noticed the light changing. He noticed the birds. He noticed that he was noticing things he would not have tracked 6 months ago, small particular things about the world he moved through every day, and he was aware without quite examining it that the noticing had something to do with the woman who walked past his study door every morning at the same time and who sometimes, when she thought he was absorbed in work, looked at the door with an expression he couldn't quite read but which was not unhappiness. He was not unhappy either. He checked that assessment carefully. He ran it the way he ran financial figures, looking for errors and assumptions and things that had been counted wrong. He was not unhappy. He was not in the same sealed state he had occupied for 4 years, the state he had constructed with care after Lady Ross, the state that had kept him safe and solitary and fully in control of every variable. He was something else. He did not have a word for it. It was not the same thing as happiness in the way he understood happiness, which was a concept he associated with other people and with periods of his past that felt very distant now. But he was not unhappy. And that, for a man who had managed himself the way he had managed himself for 4 years, was significant. He rode past the chapel on a morning in the 3rd week of February and counted 43 steps, and did not tell himself any more that he wasn't counting. The chapel door was open. The light inside it was that particular winter light through the north window, cold and clean and honest. He rode on. He did not stop. But the counting was no longer a thing he pretended wasn't happening, and that was its own small honesty. Perrin had a new horse delivered at the end of the month, a grey mare, older than Vila Steadier, purchased from a gentleman in the next county who had no further use for her. Perrin liked the mare. He said so in his way, which was by demonstrating her various qualities with the straightforward approval of a man who was not in the habit of presenting things he didn't believe in. Seraphine came to see the mare on the Saturday morning she arrived. She stood in the stable the same way she had stood with Wick, with her hand out and her body still and her patience complete. The mare nosed her hand, blew out, then accepted the scratch on her jaw with the gracious tolerance of an older horse who has known enough people to know which ones are worth her time. Perrin watched this from the stable door. He said nothing. Aldrich, who had come to the stable on separate and entirely unconnected business that happened to coincide, watched from the other end and said nothing either. The mare had been given no name yet. Perrin had been waiting to see what name came out of the horse. You didn't name a new horse before you knew her. That was a principle Perrin held with the same conviction other men held their religious beliefs. Fern, Seraphine said quietly to the mare. Perrin considered this. Fern, he said, as if saying it out loud would test whether it fit. He looked at the mare. The mare, as if aware she was being assessed, stood with the particular dignity of grey mares everywhere. Fern, Perrin said again. He nodded. That was it. The mare was Fern. Aldrich watched his head groom defer to his wife on the question of naming a horse, and understood that something had shifted in the landscape of this estate in a way that was not reversible, and that the shifting had happened slowly enough that he had missed the exact moment it became permanent. He did not know whether to be troubled by that. He decided, riding back to the house through the February light that was still not warm but was longer and therefore better, that troubled was not the right word. The right word was something closer to aware. He was aware of what was happening, of what had changed, of where things were going without anyone having decided they would go there. He was aware. He did not know yet what to do with that awareness. But the awareness itself was a beginning, and beginnings, he was old enough to know, were the part you did not get to choose. They chose themselves at the moments they had decided on, in the forms they had decided to take. This one had decided to take the form of a grey mare named Fern. He had no objection to that. The letter from Myra arrived on a Tuesday in March when the first real warmth had been in the air for 2 days, and the south grounds were showing early color, small stubborn flowers pushing through ground that had been frozen for months. Seraphine read it at breakfast, which she did not usually do with the Staffordshire letters. She usually took them to the library. This one she opened at the table, which was either because she had already guessed what it contained, or because she was tired of being careful about the reading of it. Aldrich watched her face while she read. He did not intend to. He was reading his own correspondence, a letter from the estate solicitor about a border matter that had been filed away for the winter. But he was aware of her in the way he was always aware of her now, a background awareness that had become part of the room the way the fire and the window were part of the room. Her face changed while she read, not dramatically. She was not a woman whose face gave things away in loud ways. But something moved behind her eyes and her hands on the paper went very still, and then she put the letter down and took a piece of bread from the rack and ate it with the careful deliberateness of someone who is anchoring themselves to a simple physical action. He looked back at his own letter. 3 minutes passed. He read the same sentence from the solicitor 4 times and did not remember it any of the 4 times. "She knows," Seraphine said. He looked up. "Myra," she said. She was looking at the letter on the table, not at him. "She knows why I came here, not everything, but enough. She wrote to someone in Staffordshire who is connected to our father's solicitor, and she worked out the scale of it, the debts, what needed to happen to clear them." She paused. "She's angry, she has a right to be, she thinks I should have told her." She picked up the letter again, her hands were steady. "She says I don't have to protect her anymore, that she's not 12 years old and she would have found another way if I'd let her help." Seraphine folded the letter, precisely as if the precision mattered. "She's right, she would have found another way. She's smarter than I give her credit for, and I give her a great deal of credit." She set the folded letter beside her plate. "I came here because it was the fastest way to fix what needed fixing," she said, still not looking at him. "And because I assessed you as someone I could be in a house with, which I told you. What I did not tell you is that I also assessed the arrangement as temporary. In my head, I thought that once the debts were settled and Myra was established, there might be a way to renegotiate." She looked at the letter. "I had not thought carefully about what renegotiation means in the context of a marriage." He was very still. "I'm not saying I want to renegotiate," she said. She looked at him now directly. "I'm saying I came here with a transactional view of what this was, and the view has become more complicated. And Myra's letter has made me aware that I have been handling this whole thing with a level of private calculation that is not entirely honest, and you deserve to know that." The morning was quiet. Outside, through the dining room window, the south grounds were doing their small, early spring business. A blackbird was on the lawn with the focused attention of a bird that has identified something under the soil and is working out the best approach. "Why did you come here to tell me this at breakfast?" he said, "instead of the library?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I was tired," she said, "of being careful." He looked at the letter beside her plate. He thought about what she had just said and what it cost her to say it, and what it meant that she had said it here in the morning at the table, with the bread rack between them and the blackbird on the lawn. He thought about a girl at 15, managing everything alone with no one managing for her in return. He thought about the way she handled the ledgers and the staff and the social geometry of the Fenwick dinner and Lady Ross in the doorway, and all of it, alone, with the competence she had built from necessity and the privacy she had maintained because there had never been anyone with whom she could afford to be otherwise. "The debts are settled," he said. She looked at him. "As of January," he said, "I dealt with them in the estate review. They were not substantial enough to require discussion. I considered it part of the arrangement." The quiet between them changed quality. "You didn't tell me," she said. "You didn't ask." He paused. "I thought you knew." "I didn't know." He looked at the letter. He thought about the Tuesdays, the carefully written letters, the not lying without lying. He thought about what it meant that she had been carrying this reason, this original reason, for 6 months without knowing it had already been addressed. "I should have told you," he said. "That was not well done of me." She absorbed this. The blackbird outside made a successful excavation and flew off with whatever it had found. "Write to Myra," Aldrich said. "Tell her what you told me, that the view has become more complicated. She sounds like a person who would find that easier to live with than the alternative." Seraphine was looking at him with the look he could not always read, the one that appeared when he had done something outside the expected parameters. "I'll write to her today," she said. And he said, "Tell her about the South Grounds, the botanical survey, the 11 species. She should know that it's waiting for her when she comes." The word when landed differently than if would have. Seraphine heard it, he saw her hear it. She nodded once. After breakfast, he went to the study and she went somewhere in the direction of the library. And the house did what it always did, which was carry on, the staff moving through it, the dogs sleeping in patches of spring light, the fires going through the morning. At noon, he found a note on his study desk, her hand. It said thank you for January and for the spring. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about everything the note contained, and everything it didn't say, and the precise economy of it. 2 lines that held 6 months of complicated truth in them with nothing wasted. He kept the note. He put it in the drawer of his desk, not the drawer where he kept things he wasn't ready to look at, but the middle drawer, where he kept things he referred to regularly. He did not examine this distinction too closely, but it was there. That evening they sat in the drawing room after dinner, which they had taken to doing without it having been proposed as a custom. It had simply become the shape of their evenings. The fire, the 2 chairs at a comfortable and not performatively close distance, the dogs preferring the hearthrug to anywhere else in the world. Occasionally a book, occasionally conversation, occasionally just the fire going and the quiet between them that had stopped requiring anything. Seraphine had a letter in front of her on the small table, writing it in stages as she read something and set it down and thought and wrote again. The letter to Myra. He knew it from the paper and from the deliberateness with which she was composing it. He read, she wrote, the fire moved between them. At 9:30 she folded the letter and sealed it, and sat back in the chair, and looked at the fire with the face of someone who has said a difficult thing, and is waiting to see if the world holds together after the saying. She'll be glad, he said, without looking up from his book. Seraphine looked at him. Myra, he said, when she reads it, whatever you've said, she'll be glad you said it. People who love you are generally glad when you stop protecting them and let them see what's actually happening. She looked at him for a long moment. You sound like someone who has learned that the hard way, she said. He turned a page. Most things worth knowing are learned the hard way. She was quiet. Outside, the wind was doing something mild to the new growth in the south gardens, the kind of wind that doesn't break anything but moves it, tests it, and then lets it settle back into itself. Aldrich, she said. He looked up. It was the first time she had used his name without the formal address before it. It landed on him like something he hadn't known he was waiting for. When spring comes, she said, when Myra comes, I want you to know that whatever this is, whatever it has become, I am not afraid of it anymore. She held his gaze. I thought you should know that. He looked at her. He thought about the terms he had set in October, and the distance he had maintained, and the 43 steps he had counted and not counted, and then finally just counted because the pretending was becoming more work than the counting. All right, he said. It was not, by any objective measure, a sufficient response to what she had said. But she smiled briefly, in the way she sometimes smiled when he had said exactly the right inadequate thing at exactly the right moment, and she looked back at the fire, and he looked back at his book. The evening continued, the fire held, the wind moved through the new growth in the south gardens without breaking anything. And in the house, something that had been moving slowly toward something for 6 months arrived, that night, at a resting point. Not an ending, not even a beginning in the dramatic sense. Just the point where 2 people who had been wary for good reasons stopped being wary and started being something else instead, something that had no formal name in the vocabulary of arranged marriages and formal terms and carefully maintained distances. Something warmer. Something that the South Gardens would soon have botanical evidence of, in 11 documented species and 1 young botanist who was coming in the spring, and who would be glad to come. March became April with the decisiveness of a season that has been waiting to arrive. The south grounds came into their first real color, and Aldrich found himself walking through them with more attention than he usually gave the gardens, identifying the documented species that Mrs. Holt had found listed in his grandmother's papers, making a note of their locations against a rough map so that Myra's visit would have a clear starting point. He did this on a Sunday afternoon when the light was good and the air still had a thread of cool in it, but only just. He was not a man who spent Sunday afternoons in the garden. He was a man who spent Sunday afternoons in the study with the correspondence that hadn't been addressed during the week. He changed this pattern without particularly noting that he was changing it, which was becoming a habit, the changing of things without a formal announcement to himself. Perrin found him crouching over a plant by the east garden wall, and regarded him with the dignified neutrality that was his response to all unusual behavior in people he worked for. "The Staffordshire lady is interested in plants, then," Perrin said. "Yes," Aldrich said. He was looking at a small plant with grey-green leaves that appeared in the older catalogue under a Latin name he could not pronounce fluently. "She coming soon?" "May, I think." Perrin nodded. He looked at the plant. He looked at the Duke. He said nothing further, which was the Perrin equivalent of a lengthy assessment. "Is there something you want to say?" Aldrich asked. "No, Your Grace," Perrin said, in the voice that meant there were approximately 4 things he wanted to say and was choosing not to say any of them. Aldrich stood up. "Say it." Perrin considered. "Fern likes the Duchess," he said. "She's particular about people." "I know she is." "Wick liked her too." He paused. "That bay had the best judgment of character I've seen in a horse since Vila's Dam." He walked away then, back toward the stable, having said precisely what he came to say and nothing more. Aldrich stood in the south garden with his grandmother's plant catalogue, and thought about horses and character, and the particular judgment of animals who have no incentive to be wrong. The Sunday afternoons in the garden became, over the following 3 weeks, a quiet pattern. Sometimes Seraphine came. Sometimes she didn't. When she came, she brought the plant catalogue, and they worked through it together with the brisk companionability of 2 people who have decided that doing a useful thing alongside each other is easier than navigating the alternative. She knew plants in a way that surprised him, not the academic knowledge of someone who had studied from books, but the practical knowledge of someone who had grown up with a garden and paid attention. She had a garden in Staffordshire, she said once, when he asked about it. She had made it herself, in a corner of the callow grounds that nobody else wanted because the light was wrong and the soil was difficult. She had been making it since she was 13, and it was, she said, the thing she was most honestly sorry to have left. He listened to her say this and then said, "Is there a reason you can't make another one here?" She looked at the south grounds. She looked at him. She said, No, I don't suppose there is." The gardener was consulted. A section of the south grounds was formally designated, not formally in the way of a state business, not in papers or ledgers, formally in the way that 2 people standing in a garden come to an understanding about what is going to happen in that space and what it will mean. She chose the corner that got the most varied light, the difficult corner. He supposed he should not have been surprised. He did not tell Orin about the garden. He did not need to. Orin, who had been watching the shape of things change for months with the attention of a man whose business was the Duke's well-being, had already adjusted the household schedule on 3 separate occasions to account for things that were different now, and that no one had formally announced were different. That was Orin's gift. He managed the practical requirements of the life as it actually was, not the life as it had been arranged on paper. He appeared at the study door one afternoon, in the 3rd week of April, with the mail and something else. "The arrangement with the Callow household," Orin said, setting the mail on the desk. He said it the way he said everything, without inflection or implication, the words as neutral as a weather report, the formal terms. Whether it might be time to discuss revisions. Aldrich looked at him. "I'm only asking," Orin said, "because the rooms." "The rooms," Aldrich said. "The distance of them," Orin said, "between the blue room and the master rooms, it is a considerable walk, in winter especially." There was a silence in the study that contained a great deal. "I'm not," Aldrich said carefully, "in a position to discuss revisions at this time." "Of course, Your Grace." Orin left. Aldrich sat for a long time looking at the middle desk drawer where the note was kept. 2 lines, "Thank you for January," and for the spring. He was not yet in a position to discuss revisions. That was true. He knew why it was true. He knew the name of the reason, which was a 4-year-old reason with a woman's face and a laugh that had been designed to land precisely where it had landed, and which had taught him, in the way that only cruelty efficiently teaches, that the distance between opening yourself to another person and being made catastrophically small by that openness was a distance that could be crossed by someone else in an instant. He knew all of that. He also knew that Seraphine was not that. He had been watching her for 6 months with the specific attentiveness of a man looking for the thing that would confirm his worst expectation, and he had not found it. She had not deceived him once. She had not performed warmth she didn't have. She had not been strategic in the way that left residue. She had simply been what she was, day after day in the cold and in the spring, with the dogs and with the ledgers and with Myra's letter and with Wick outside the stable. He knew the difference. He was not a stupid man, he had the evidence. What he did not yet have, and what was the only real remaining obstacle, was the nerve. He was working on it. Spring was working on it with him, as spring does, patient and completely indifferent to resistance. He picked up his mail. He opened the first letter, which was from his solicitor and was entirely about a property matter. He read it. He was going to be all right. He just needed a little more time. The spring charity concert was held in the last week of April at the Assembly Rooms in the market town, an annual event organized by a committee of county ladies in aid of the local infirmary, and which Aldrich attended every year with the reliable punctuality of a man who understood that public appearances were part of the cost of the position, and managed the cost without complaint. This year he attended with his wife, which was the first of these events where that had been true, and which created a particular quality of attention in the assembly rooms that he recognized immediately and ignored completely. The concert itself was adequate in the way that county concerts were usually adequate, earnest and well-intentioned, and occasionally very good and occasionally very not. There was a soprano who was genuinely fine. There was a young man on the pianoforte who had technique and was still working on feeling. There was a string quartet of 4 people who were clearly friends and whose enjoyment of each other made up for the occasional lapse in precision. Seraphine listened with the concentrated attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting, which was itself something to observe. She was not performing appreciation. She was actually appreciating, which gave her face in the concert room a quality he did not often see, because the things she did in public were usually things she was managing as well as experiencing, and here she was just experiencing. He sat beside her and listened to the soprano, and was aware, without turning his head, of the exact position of her hands in her lap and the particular angle of her face, and the way she closed her eyes for 2 bars in the middle of the soprano's best passage, not from sentimentality but from concentration, wanting the full sound without any visual information competing with it. He had not expected to enjoy the concert. He enjoyed the concert. In the interval, the assembly rooms took on the usual properties of a gathering between movements, the conversations resuming, the refreshment tables sustaining their enthusiastic cues, the charitable organizational ladies circulating with the focused warmth of women who had a target donation figure in mind and were managing toward it. Lady Fenwick found them, as Lady Fenwick generally found people she wanted to find, with the quiet inevitability of a woman who knew the floor plan of every room she entered. "You both must be pleased about the Hartley event," she said, with the brightness of someone who has information and is offering the first piece of it to see how it lands. Aldrich looked at her. "The assembly in June," Lady Fenwick said, "at Hartley Park. It will be the first large gathering of the summer season. Everyone will be there, I imagine," she smiled, "including, I understand, the Rosses." Aldrich kept his face at its usual temperature. "I wasn't aware of the invitation," he said. "Oh, it will come," Lady Fenwick said. "Lord Hartley always sends them in May. It will certainly come to you both." Her gaze moved to Seraphine with the measuring quality that Aldrich now recognized as Lady Fenwick's version of genuine interest. "I think it would be a wonderful occasion." She moved on to other people. She was good at the interval. Aldrich did not look at Seraphine. Seraphine was looking at the refreshment table with the same measured neutrality she applied to complicated ledger entries. "We don't have to go," he said. "Of course we should go," she said. "It's the summer season. It would be remarked if we didn't." "It will be remarked regardless." "Then we may as well control what is being remarked about." She looked at him sideways. "Unless you'd prefer not to." He said nothing. She turned to face him more fully. In the assembly room, around them, 30 conversations were happening simultaneously. The soprano was retying something at the side of her dress. The pianoforte young man was eating a sandwich with the focused relief of a person who has just survived a difficult experience. "Aldrich," she said quietly. The name had been coming more easily since March. He had noticed each time and had not mentioned it. "I understand what the Hartley event represents. I understand she will be there. I'm not asking you to pretend it is an ordinary occasion. I'm only saying that you should go because it is the right move for the estate and for our position in this county, and I will be beside you, and whatever it costs you to be in that room, I will not make it cost more." He looked at her. "That is what I am able to offer," she said. "Not the management of your feelings, because I don't have access to those and wouldn't presume to try. Just my presence in that room functioning as it should." The interval bell rang. Around them, people began to move back toward the main hall. "All right," he said. She nodded once and turned toward the door, and they walked back in with the crowd, and the second half of the concert began, and the soprano's final piece was the best thing in the evening, long and clear and reaching, and when it was done the applause was genuine and complete, and Aldrich put his hands together with everyone else and felt, through the noise, the particular stillness of a man who has just agreed to something he is not certain he can manage, and who has agreed anyway. On the drive home, the night was mild for April, the kind of night that doesn't know yet it isn't quite summer, and the carriage moved through it in a way that was different from the winter rides, the dark less absolute, the world around the road showing its shapes rather than hiding them. "You played piano when you were young," Seraphine said. "It was not a question." He looked at her. "How did you know that?" "The way you were watching the boy at the pianoforte. You knew what was hard and what wasn't. You knew where the feeling was missing." He was quiet for a moment. "Until I was 12, he said. "My mother taught me. When she died, I stopped." Seraphine received this, without filling the space around it with anything. "She would have liked tonight," he said. He did not say this to be said. He said it because it was true, and the truth of it arrived at the moment he said it, surprising him into honesty the way true things sometimes do. "Tell me something about her," Seraphine said. He looked out the window at the mild dark. He thought about his mother. He thought about the piano lessons and the library and the way she had talked to his father, with the directness of a woman who had long since stopped performing. He thought about the garden at Millhaven that was a little wild in a way she loved, and his father had accepted. "She kept bees," he said. "She was the only one in the household who could manage them without getting stung. She said it was about attitude, that bees could tell if you were afraid of them and reacted to it. She said most things were like that they responded to what you actually were, not what you were trying to look like." He had not thought about that in years. "She sounds remarkable," Seraphine said. "She was ordinary in the best way," he said. "She was exactly what she was, and she didn't apologize for it or dress it up or manage it into something more impressive. She was just entirely herself all the time, and that turned out to be more than enough." The carriage was quiet for a moment. "I think," Seraphine said carefully, "that you have been trying to be that for a long time, and that something made you stop trusting that it was enough." He did not answer. She did not push it. Outside, the spring night moved past and the estate came into view, the house with its lit windows and the dogs who would be somewhere near the door, and the south gardens invisible in the dark but there, with the corner she had chosen and the difficult light and the 11 species. He got out of the carriage and held his hand up for her to take, and she took it steady, the way she took everything, and they walked into the house together, and the dogs came clicking across the floor, and Breck pushed his head against Seraphine's hand with the absolute conviction of a dog who knows where home is. He stood in the front hall that had been his for 31 years, and looked at the woman who had been in it for 6 months and thought about his mother and bees, and the things that respond to what you actually are rather than what you're trying to look like. He thought about what he was trying to look like. He thought about what he actually was. They were not, he knew, the same thing, not anymore. Not after 6 months in the same house with someone who had never once been deceived by the difference. "Good night," Seraphine said. She turned toward the stairs. "Good night," he said. She went up. He listened to her footsteps, which he had learned the way you learn everything in the house you live in, the particular cadence and weight of them. He stood in the hall for a moment with the dogs. The Hartley event was in June. It was only April. He had time to work out what he actually was before then. He hoped. He went to the study and he sat down and he didn't pick anything up. He just sat in the room where his father's letter had arrived on a Wednesday and where he had picked up an apple and forgotten about it. And he sat there in the spring dark and thought about what the past 6 months had cost him and what they had given him, and whether the ledger balanced, and whether balancing was even the right way to think about it. He decided it wasn't. The right way to think about it was not as a balance but as a direction. He had been moving in one direction for 4 years, which was away from everything that had the capacity to hurt him, and the movement had been efficient and successful, and had left him in a house alone with a dead man's arrangement and 2 dogs and a functioning estate. And then the letter had come, and then she had come. And he had been moving in a different direction since, slowly at first and then less slowly, in the way of a thing that doesn't announce itself but simply continues in the direction it has chosen until it arrives. He was still moving. The direction was becoming clearer. He put out the lamp and went to bed, and outside the spring night did its quiet and persistent work, and by morning it would be slightly warmer, and the corner of the south garden that she had chosen would be there in the new light, ready for what was going to be planted in it. May arrived like a promise that intended to be kept, warm and long in the light, and full of the specific energy that this part of England produced in its best weeks, when the grass was vivid, and the sky was the kind of blue that seemed to have been personally selected rather than just provided. The north pasture was doing something extraordinary with wildflowers in the south corner, a patch of purple and white that Aldrich had never noticed before, and that Seraphine had identified within a week of the season turning, adding it to the botanical map she had been keeping. He had not known there was a botanical map until she showed him, on a Saturday evening when they were in the drawing room with the windows open for the first time that year. She had been building it since February, a careful hand-drawn record of species locations across the grounds, with notes and dates and small, precise illustrations in the margins. It was, he recognized, the kind of document that would have taken a professional surveyor weeks to produce, done in the margins of her regular work, in the evenings when the household was settled. He looked at it for a long time. "This is for Myra," he said. "Yes," she said, "but also for the estate. It should exist regardless." She took it back and set it on the table beside her. "There are 3 species in the north corner I haven't confirmed yet. I need a clearer morning." "I know the north corner," he said. "There's a better approach from the east gate." She looked at him. "Saturday mornings," he said. "When I ride out early, I could show you the east approach." It was not technically a significant offer. It was a route through a field. She understood, as she always understood, what was happening underneath the technical offer. "Saturday mornings," she said. "Yes, all right." They went the following Saturday at the early hour that was already becoming warm, the light slanted and golden through the east gate and the path clear under the new growth. He knew the north corner the way he knew all of his land, which was intimately and from every angle, and he took her by the longer route that gave the best view of the progression of species from the edge to the interior. She walked beside him with the map in one hand and a small notebook in the other and the focused attention of someone conducting a survey, which was exactly what she was doing, and he walked with her and pointed out the features of the terrain as he knew them, and she noted them, and the conversation that developed over the 45 minutes of the survey was the most natural conversation they had yet had. Free of the management that their public exchanges required and free of the careful consideration that their private ones usually carried. They talked about the land the way people who both know a subject can talk about it. He knew the land historically, structurally, from a stewardship perspective. She knew it botanically, ecologically, from the perspective of what grew where and why, and what it needed. Together the knowledge was more complete than either of them had it separately. He thought about this afterward, about the more complete knowledge, about what it meant to be in the presence of someone whose understanding complemented yours instead of competing with it or deferring to it. He thought about his mother and the bees, that things respond to what you actually are. He wrote a letter to Lord Callow that afternoon, not about the estate, not about business. He wrote it to suggest, as formally and briefly as he could manage, that Myra might come to the Voss estate in May rather than June, as the botanical season was best engaged early. He sent it before he had thought about it long enough to qualify it. The reply came in a week. Lord Callow was happy to send Myra in May. He included, in his usual fashion, several paragraphs about the quality of the roads from Staffordshire and his own health, which was, as usual, a secondary subject dressed in primary clothing. Seraphine received this news at Tuesday breakfast by the same channel as always, the Staffordshire letter. She read it. She set it down. She looked at him. "You wrote to my father," she said. "To move the timing," he said, "the botanical season." She looked at the letter. She looked at him. And something happened in her face that he had not seen before, a specific openness, as if the thing she had been holding composed was composing itself differently, into something that didn't need to be held at all. She blinked once, she picked up her coffee. "She'll be here Thursday week," she said. "I'll tell Oren to prepare the green room," he said. "It has the best morning light." She nodded, she drank her coffee. She looked out the window at the May morning as if it were offering her something she had not been certain was coming. He ate his breakfast. He turned a page of the estate gazette that was beside his plate and did not read a single word of it. The week before Myra's arrival was full and practical and moved quickly. Aldrich managed the estate business with his usual efficiency, which was easier this month than it had been all winter, and he noticed the ease without examining it too carefully. The green room was prepared. The south gardens were at their best. The corner Seraphine had chosen showing the first real signs of what it was becoming. The botanical map was complete through the north corner and extended now to the east garden and the old orchard. He added a note to his study calendar on Thursday week. It said simply, "M arrives." He had put the initials without thinking about it. When he noticed what he had written, he considered changing it and did not. The days between that Saturday and the East Gate and Thursday week were good days. The kind that come occasionally in a life and are not always recognized at the time as the kind they are. Simple and sufficient, warm in the light and even in the temperature, the work going well and the evenings in the drawing room with the windows open, the dogs outside on the south lawn in the long evening light, and two people sitting in the habit of each other's company that had grown up without announcement, like the plants in the difficult corner, doing what they were designed to do. He was aware that this was what happiness felt like, not the dramatic version, not the version he had once imagined it to be, which was a condition you entered like a room with a door and a clear threshold. The real version, which was an accumulation of ordinary things that together added up to something you only recognized when you stopped and looked at the whole of it, and realized you had been in it for some time without noticing. He was in it. It was strange and new, and a little frightening and entirely worth being frightened of. On Wednesday evening, the night before Myra was due to arrive, Seraphine said, over the dinner that had been easy for several weeks now, "She's going to like you. I should warn you so you're prepared." He looked at her. "Is that a warning or a prediction?" "Both," she said. "She's perceptive. She notices things about people that they often don't show consciously, and she will notice that you wrote to my father. She will absolutely notice that." "Will it be a problem?" Seraphine considered. "For Myra, no, she'll just add it to her assessment and revise accordingly. She's very good at revision." She paused. "She reminds me of you in that way. She forms a view and holds it, and then when the evidence changes, she changes the view without any performance about it." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't always change the view," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said, "but you do, eventually." He thought about that for the rest of the evening. He thought about a view that had been held for 4 years against considerable accumulating evidence that the view might need revising. He thought about the view and when exactly he had started the revision, and whether there had been a single moment he could point to or whether it had been, as he suspected, a continuous and quiet erosion. He thought that if he was honest, the erosion had started the first day, on the steps in October, a woman who was not afraid of him. He thought about Thursday week. He thought, with a feeling he could not quite name but was not going to fight anymore, that this year was going to turn out to be a very different year from the one that had started on a Wednesday in September with a letter and an apple and the particular shock of being arranged by a dying man. He slept well that night. For the first time in longer than he could accurately recall, he slept through the whole of it, deeply and without waking once. The spring night outside was mild and complete, and the south gardens in the dark did their patient work, and the botanist was coming in the morning, and there were 11 species waiting for her, mapped and ready. He heard her 6 weeks before he admitted to himself that he had heard her. This was the thing he understood only later, looking back. She had been going to the chapel since December. He had known since December. He had gritted the path and counted 43 steps and ridden past on early mornings and filed it all under practical headings and personal boundaries and the clear agreed terms of their arrangement. He had known and had kept not knowing, which is its own kind of knowledge. The morning he actually heard her was the 3rd of June. He knew the date because the Hartley invitation had arrived the day before and he had put it on his desk, and then moved it to the drawer and then taken it back out and left it on the desk again. And none of this was behavior he was proud of. He had not slept well. He had come downstairs at 4:30 in the manner of a man who has given up on the night and is trying the early morning instead. He had not planned to walk to the east garden. He was going to the kitchen for something warm, and the route he chose, the route through the side passage and out through the east corridor, was not the kitchen route but was the chapel route, and he was aware of this and chose it anyway, which told him something about himself that he was not quite ready to receive. The door was open, the same thread of light, the same 43 steps from where he stood. He heard her voice through the open door. Not loudly, conversationally quiet, the voice of someone speaking privately, not performing speech, not presenting it but simply making it, the way a person speaks when they know no one is listening. She was praying. He stood outside in the early June morning, with the light beginning its reluctant gray arrival in the east, and listened to his wife pray in a cold stone chapel for a man who had spent 6 months making himself unavailable to her. She was not praying for herself. She was not praying for the estate or for anything practical or for outcomes she wanted. She was praying for him, for Aldrich. She used his name, which landed on him with the same weight it always did when she said it, but heavier now, this context adding a layer he had not known was possible. She said his name and then she said, quietly and without performance, that she hoped he would find peace. That whatever was in him that had closed itself off, that she hoped it would be allowed to open again at whatever pace it needed in whatever time. She said she had not come to force anything. She said she did not know if what she felt was what she thought it was because she had not had occasion to know what that felt like before, but that whatever it was, she wanted him to be well, more than she wanted anything else, more than the arrangement, more than the position, just well. She said his name one more time. Then she was quiet. He stood outside the chapel in the early morning and felt something happen in his chest that did not have a name in any vocabulary he had previously used. Not breaking, because the word breaking implied a break from a state that had been intact, and he was not sure the state had been intact for quite some time. Something more like a door opening that had been kept shut from the inside by effort, and the effort stopping, and the door opening of its own weight. He had spent 4 years managing his heart the way he managed the estate, with efficiency and systematics and strategic planning, and the consistent application of good sense. He had restructured the emotional portfolio after Lady Ross the way he had restructured the northern tenant agreements after a bad season, identifying the loss and cutting it clean and setting better terms. It had worked. He had managed himself back into function and stayed there. 4 years of clean and managed function, no unnecessary exposure, no unnecessary risk. He was standing outside a chapel at 4:30 in the morning in June, having counted 43 steps from a stone path. The managing was over. He did not go in. That was not the moment for going in. He was not yet the man who could walk through that door with what he was feeling and say anything that was equal to it. He needed time and space, and the chance to sort through what had just happened in his chest, which was not a small event despite its small and quiet setting. He walked back to the house. He went to the kitchen and he sat at the kitchen table, which he had never sat at before in 31 years because it was not a thing men in his position did. And Cook, who came in at 5 to start the morning work, found him there and said nothing about the unusual nature of it but put a pot on the fire and set a cup in front of him without being asked. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee that Cook made and looked at the kitchen wall and thought about a woman who had been managing things alone since she was 15, who had come here in October to fix a problem that wasn't her fault, who had organized the household and found the accounting errors and managed Lady Ross in the Fenwick drawing room and gritted out the letters to Myra and stood outside the stable in January in the cold, and who had chosen, in the privacy of a chapel before dawn, to spend her prayer on his peace rather than her own comfort. He thought about what kind of person that was. He thought about what it meant that he had been in the same house with that person for 6 months, and had spent those 6 months keeping the carefully agreed distance because keeping the distance was safe. He thought about safe. He had been safe for 4 years. He had been safe and the estate had run well and the accounts had balanced, and he had managed everything with perfect efficiency, and had been in every technical sense fine. He was done being fine. He drank the coffee. Cook worked around him without making him feel that his presence at the kitchen table was unusual. She was that kind of cook. At 6, when he heard the house beginning to stir and the footsteps on the upper floors, He got up and thanked Cook, who nodded in the way of a woman who accepts thanks but doesn't require it. He went to the study. He sat at his desk. He took the Hartley invitation out of the drawer where he had moved it and looked at it. The Hartley Assembly, June, Lady Ross would be there. He had spent several weeks experiencing this fact as a problem to manage. He understood now that it was not a problem. Lady Ross was not a problem. She had not been a problem for a long time, had been a problem only in his construction of her as one, in the way he had used her as the proof of a case he had already decided to make, the case against opening himself to anything that had the capacity to cost him. The case was closed. He had a wife who prayed for his peace by name before the house was awake. He put the Hartley invitation on his desk in the open position and wrote a line to the secretary confirming their attendance. Then he sat for a while with his hands folded and thought about 43 steps and what it would mean to take them. Myra was coming Thursday. Seraphine was in the chapel, which she would leave in approximately 10 minutes based on the pattern of the past 6 months, and then she would walk the gritted path back to the house, and in approximately 30 minutes she would come down for breakfast, and they would sit at the table with the bread rack and the morning light and the blackbird if the blackbird was inclined to the lawn. He was going to do something different today at breakfast. He did not know exactly what. He did not have a speech. He was not a man who had speeches. He had instead the truth, which was that he had been moving in a direction for 6 months and the direction had a destination and he was almost at it, and she deserved to know. He straightened his coat. He waited. The morning came on slowly, the way June mornings do when the night has been mild and the transition is gradual, and the light through his study window moved from gray to the first pale gold of the actual day, and the house moved into its morning shape around him, and he sat in it and was still. At 6:30, he heard her on the stairs. He heard her in the hall. He heard her pause, which she always did, to touch Breck's ear on the way to the dining room. He stood up from his desk. He walked to the dining room. She was at the table with her coffee, looking at the morning through the window. The blackbird was on the lawn. The south gardens beyond were full of the early June light, and the corner she had made was doing something quietly excellent in that light, the first real color of her choosing. She looked up when he came in. He sat down, he poured his coffee, he looked at her. "I was at the chapel this morning," he said. She went very still. "Not inside," he said. "I was walking early, I passed." She held his gaze, she did not speak. "I heard you," he said. The room was completely quiet. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't," he said. "And I'm not going to pretend that what I heard didn't land where it landed. That would be dishonest, and I think we've been honest with each other in a way I didn't expect to be, and I don't want to stop." Her hands were around her cup, very still. "I came to breakfast to tell you," he said, "that I have been moving towards something for 6 months, and I think you have too, and I think we've been careful about it because we're both people who have learned to be careful about the things that matter. But I would like to stop being careful about this particular thing, if you're willing." She looked at him for a long time. The blackbird moved on the lawn. The June morning did its work around them. "I'm willing," she said. It was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table, not far, not dramatically, just the distance between two people who are already sitting across from each other, and he put his hand over hers where it was wrapped around the cup. She turned her hand over. He held it. They sat like that in the morning light, with the bread rack between them and the blackbird on the lawn and the south garden doing its excellent business in the early sun, and it was very ordinary and entirely sufficient, and nothing like what he had imagined the moment of it would be, which was how he knew it was the right moment. Real things never look the way you imagine them. They look like a Tuesday morning and a cup of coffee and a hand turned over on a table. They look like this. The rest of that morning had the quality of a day that knows what has happened in it and adjusts accordingly. The light was the same. The work was the same. The house ran in its usual patterns, but something in the air of it had shifted, the specific atmospheric pressure of a place where two people have stopped performing something they no longer needed to perform. Mrs. Holt noticed. She noticed with the radar she kept calibrated to the emotional temperature of the house, the same radar that had told her in November that something was beginning even though nothing had been announced. She said nothing. She went about her work with the contained satisfaction of a woman whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. Orin noticed. He said nothing either, but the arrangement of Aldrich's afternoon appointments was reorganized with an efficiency that suggested someone had freed up a particular 2-hour window without being asked. It was the window in which, Aldrich would discover, Seraphine had decided to work in the South Garden. He went to the South Garden at 3. She was in the difficult corner, on her knees in the dark soil with her good skirt exchanged for something older, her hair in a more practical arrangement, working with the focused attention she brought to all things that required her hands and her knowledge simultaneously. He crouched down beside her, not because he was a man who knew about gardens, he was not particularly. He crouched down because the action of crouching beside someone who is working is the action of saying I'm here without requiring words. She looked at him sideways. Do you know what this is? She indicated a plant he didn't recognize. No, he said. Myra will, she said. She'll identify it in approximately 30 seconds and then give me a 5-minute explanation of its habitat requirements and seed dispersal method that I will understand about 60% of and pretend to understand the rest. She sat back on her heels. She does it because she loves talking about it. I let her because I love watching her love talking about it. We have been operating this particular arrangement since she was 14. He thought about what it meant to love someone's way of loving something. The specific tenderness of it. She's going to want to know everything, Seraphine said, not with anxiety, just stating the fact. I know, he said. She looked at him. I'm not afraid of her knowing, he said, if you're asking. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I wasn't asking, I was warning you. She'll want to know everything about you, not to judge. She's not that kind of perceptive, she's the kind who wants to understand. Then I'll let her understand, he said. Seraphine looked at him for a moment with the expression he had filed and never adequately labeled, the one that was recognition and something more, something that had been building since October and now, in the June light of the corner she'd made in the difficult ground, didn't have any reason to remain private. You have been, she said slowly, considerably more than I assessed you as being in October. You assessed me as someone you could be in a house with without coming to harm, he said. Yes. And now. She looked at the corner she had made, the plants she had chosen in the difficult soil with the complicated light. She looked at the botanical map folded in her pocket that documented 11 species across his grandmother's grounds. She looked at him. Now, she said, I think I've been in a house with someone I am considerably more interested in than I was prepared for. He thought about a young woman at 15 managing a household alone. He thought about the terms she had offered him in the drawing room in October, the fairness and the honesty in place of the warmth she hadn't been certain she could ask for. He thought about the chapel and the early mornings and the prayer she had thought no one heard. He had heard it. He was going to keep hearing it, he thought, for a long time, in the way that true things become part of you and cannot be separated back out. The Hartley Assembly is in 3 weeks, he said. I know. I'd like to go with you, he said, not because it's the right move for the estate. Because I want to be in that room with you. She absorbed this. The garden was quiet around them except for the business of the early summer, birds and wind, and the distant sound of Perrin somewhere in the direction of the stable. Lady Ross will be there, she said. Yes, and you're not concerned about that. He thought about this carefully. He thought about what Lady Ross had been 4 years ago and what the echo of her had been in the years since, and what it had cost him, and what he had built out of the cost. He thought about whether she was still something to be concerned about. No, he said, I'm not concerned about that. Seraphine looked at him with the directness that had been there since the first day, the gaze that assessed without flattering. She assessed him now, he let her. All right, she said. She turned back to the plant in the soil. Hand me that. She indicated a small tool near his foot. He handed it over. She worked the soil around the plant with the focused precision of someone who knows exactly what they are doing, and he sat beside her in the difficult corner of the garden in the June afternoon, and it was the most useful he had felt in a very long time. Not because he was doing something, because he was beside someone. The difference between those two things was something he had not fully understood until 6 months ago. He understood it now. He sat in the garden until the light began to shift toward evening. He did not do anything in particular. He was there, she worked. They talked occasionally, About the plants and about Myra and about the Hartley Assembly and about nothing significant. The kind of talk that fills a space between people who are comfortable in the space. When she stood to go in, he stood with her, and they walked back to the house through the south garden in the early evening light, side by side, not performing anything, just walking. Breck was at the door. He performed his usual greeting, which was thorough and democratic, and involved a significant amount of leaning. Gil opened the door. His face, which was 19 and therefore not fully in the business of concealment, performed an immediate and involuntary pleasure at the sight of them together in the doorway. He turned it into professional neutrality and mostly succeeded. Orrin was at the top of the stairs, apparently on his way somewhere, and executed the most convincing display of coincidental presence that Aldrich had ever witnessed from him, which was saying something. The house had been waiting for this, he understood, the whole of it. The staff, the dogs, the walls, the fire that burned better since the flue was cleaned, the botanical corner in the south garden. He had been the last to know. He thought that was probably right. That was probably how it had to go. The last to know was almost always the person it mattered most to. He was glad to be the last to know because the knowing, when it came, was complete. There was no part of it missing. He had arrived at it fully, with all 6 months behind him, all the evidence, all the 43 counted steps and the early morning rides and the note in the middle drawer and the hand on the table and the prayer. He had arrived. It felt like arriving home. Which was, he thought, going in through the front door of the house he had been born in, the strange and perfect accuracy of it. Myra Callow arrived on a Thursday with a trunk that was significantly heavier than it should have been for a 2-week visit, 3 notebooks that she produced immediately from a bag she carried separately, and a quality of attention so complete and alive that she seemed to take in the Voss estate in a single extended look as she stepped down from the carriage, and then spend the rest of the day filing everything she had seen into the correct categories. She was taller than Seraphine, narrower. She had the same brown hair and the same measured gaze, but where Seraphine's gaze was an assessment, Myra's was something more like absorption, the look of someone gathering data with every sense simultaneously and finding most of it fascinating. She looked at Aldrich when Seraphine introduced them, and he could see her running through something behind her eyes. He had been warned that she would do this. He let her do it without adjusting his expression. Seraphine said you prepared the green room, Myra said. She said you chose it for the morning light. Yes, he said. She nodded once, as if he had confirmed something she had already expected. The botanical map is extraordinary, she said. She sent me the first draft in March and I've been thinking about nothing else. She extended it in April, he said, through the East Garden and the old orchard. Myra's eyes went slightly brighter. She turned to Seraphine. Show me. Seraphine laughed. It was a sound he had been hearing more often in the past 3 weeks, a sound that had been there before but quieter, more contained, less willing to take up space. In the presence of her sister, it took up exactly the space it needed. Give him 5 minutes to take your trunk upstairs, Seraphine said. The trunk can wait, Myra said. You said that when we were children, and the trunk once waited 4 days in the hall before anyone unpacked it. It was a very uninteresting trunk. This one is heavier. This one has better things in it. They went to the south garden before the trunk went upstairs, which Orrin managed with the resigned efficiency of a man who had been briefed on the incoming visitor, and had anticipated exactly this outcome. He sent Gil up with the trunk and went to put on more coffee. Aldrich walked the south gardens with the Callow sisters for an hour that was, he would think later, one of the most purely enjoyable hours he had spent in recent memory. Myra moved through the grounds like a woman who had been waiting for permission to be fully herself and had just received it, dropping to her knees beside plants without concern for her skirt, producing a notebook from somewhere and writing things in it with rapid precision, asking questions of Seraphine and then occasionally of Aldrich that were specific and knowledgeable, and which he answered as accurately as he could, which was accurately enough to earn a nod from Myra that he found, despite himself, satisfying. When they reached the difficult corner, Myra stopped. She looked at it, she looked at the plants, she looked at Seraphine. You made this, she said. It's his land, Seraphine said. But you made this, Myra said in the same tone, which was not a question but a naming. She looked at Aldrich. The corner no one else wanted, the difficult light. She looked back at the corner. It's going to be extraordinary. It's beginning to be, Seraphine said. Myra looked at them both, separately and then together in the assessing way she had. She said nothing about what she was assessing, but she wrote something in her notebook and closed it and said, "Show me the old orchard." The first 3 days of her visit had the texture of a new season settling in. She was with them at breakfast and dinner, and in between she was most often in the South Gardens with her notebooks, or in the library consulting the botanical references that Aldrich had identified for her in the uncatalogued older books, or occasionally appearing in the doorway of whatever room someone was working in to ask a question, and then disappearing again, satisfied. She fit into the house the way people fit into a place when the place was made to accommodate them. The green room, apparently, was exactly right. She came down on the second morning with the relaxed face of someone who had slept very well and said, "The light at 6, did you plan that?" "Yes," Aldrich said. She looked at him, then she looked at Seraphine, then she went to pour her coffee. On the fourth evening, after dinner, Seraphine went upstairs early with a letter she needed to write and left Aldrich and Myra in the drawing room, which was either entirely natural or entirely strategic, and was probably both. He and Myra sat with their respective cups and the fire going with the controlled excellence it had achieved since the flu work, and Myra looked at the fire for a moment and then said, "She didn't tell me everything about how it has been." "No," he said. "But she looks different than she did in October," Myra said. "When she left, she looks like someone who has been put down." He thought about the weight, the thing she had been carrying, the debts and the father and the Staffordshire house and Myra and all of it, the 15-year accumulation of managing everything alone. "She has been," he said, "some of it, not all. She carries things by reflex at this point." "I know," Myra said. "She started carrying them for me when I was 12. I've been trying to take them back since I was 17. She turned her cup in her hands. "She's better at holding on than I am at taking back." "She's going to let you take some of it," he said. "She's in the process of allowing herself to be helped. It's going slower than it should because the habit is very established." Myra looked at him, the assessment again. He was becoming accustomed to it. It was not unkind, it was simply thorough. "You've been watching her carefully," Myra said. "Yes," he said. "She's been watching you too," Myra said. "She doesn't know I know that, but the letters changed in December, the way she described the house. The things she mentioned, they were your things, the horses, the accounts, the repairs. She was writing about you without writing about you." He was quiet. "She's not effusive," Myra said. "She's never been. She says a fact and the facts accumulate until they mean something larger than any one of them. I've been reading her facts about you for 6 months. She paused. "You are not what she expected." "She told me that," he said. "Did she tell you what she expected?" He thought about it. "Someone she could be in a house with without coming to harm," he said. Myra made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more serious. "Yes," she said. "That is the saddest bar I have ever heard set for a marriage," and she said it without knowing it was sad because it was the highest bar she'd ever encountered. She looked at the fire. "Our father is not a cruel man. He's simply thoroughly absent in the ways that matter. She's been compensating for that since our mother died." Aldrich looked at his cup. He thought about Lord Callow at the dinner table, refilling his glass, laughing at his own story. "She's finished compensating," he said. "I intend to make sure of that." Myra was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Good, just that." The flat and absolute approval of a 20-year-old woman who had been waiting for someone to say exactly this, and had been not quite hoping for it in case, not quite hoping, would protect her from the disappointment if it wasn't said. He could hear Seraphine in that response, the same habit of managed expectation, the same careful not hoping. "She's teaching it to you," he said. Myra looked at him. "The not hoping," he said, "you learned it from her." Myra was very still for a moment, then she said she didn't mean to teach it. "I know," he said, "she wouldn't." They sat with that for a moment, the fire moved, the dogs shifted on the hearthrug. "She told me you let me come in May instead of June," Myra said, "because of the botanical season." "Yes, that was kind," she said. "She didn't say it was kind, she said it was practical, but I know her vocabulary. When she says practical, she usually means kind." He thought about January and the debts, about the provision ledger, about the gridded path to the chapel, all of it described as practical, all of it something else. "She uses the word practical," he said. when she doesn't have the vocabulary for the other thing. Myra looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, which was a different smile from Seraphine's, wider and more immediately given, but with the same quality of warmth in it, the same specific generosity. "You've figured her out," Myra said. "I've been paying attention," he said. "That's the same thing," she said. "For Seraphine, that's exactly the same thing." He thought about that later, after Myra had said good night and the house had settled, and he was alone in the study with the fire going low. He thought about what it meant to be figured out, to have someone pay sufficient and honest attention to understand you. He thought about what Seraphine had done with that understanding, which was to bring it to a chapel at 4:30 in the morning and offer it to whatever she was speaking to in the quiet, as a reason to hope for someone else's peace. He thought about peace. He thought he was beginning to understand what it felt like, not the managed version, the controlled absence of disturbance that he had mistaken for peace for 4 years. The actual version, which was not quiet but full, not empty but warm, not the absence of things but the presence of someone. He was beginning to understand it. He went upstairs. He passed the chapel in his thoughts, as he had been passing it for 6 months, except this time he did not count anything. There was nothing to count. There was only the knowledge of what had been said inside it, and the understanding that it had been said about him by someone who did not require anything in return for having said it. He had never been prayed for before, not that he knew of. It was a strange thing to know about yourself, and stranger still to understand what it meant. He went to bed. He closed his eyes. Outside, the June night was warm and full of the sounds of the season, and the south gardens were doing their quiet summer work, and Myra was in the green room with the morning light already arranged for her, and Seraphine was somewhere nearby in the east wing, and the dogs were wherever they had decided to be, which was always wherever they were most needed. He slept. It was a good sleep, the kind that a body earns. The second week of Myra's visit contained the Hartley assembly. He had thought about it for weeks in advance and thought about it less as the week arrived, which was the natural progress of things that have been sufficiently anticipated. He knew what the evening was. He knew what he intended to do in it. He knew, with a clarity he had not had at any previous Hartley event, that the thing which had made it significant was no longer significant. They dressed for the assembly in their respective rooms in the eastern wing. Orrin was particular about his preparation. He had been particular about it for 11 years and had developed a set of standards and a method for executing them that Aldrich had long since stopped questioning. He emerged from the process looking like a man who was attending something important, which he was. Seraphine met him at the top of the stairs. She was wearing blue, a different blue from the Fennec dress, deeper, and the dress was new in the way the Fennec one had been new, made for an occasion. She wore a small pin at her collar that he recognized. It had been his mother's, a piece he had given her in March when the subject of the household's stored jewelry had come up, and he had taken the box from the safe and said, without making anything of it, that she should take whatever she wanted, that it was hers now and had been waiting to be used. She had chosen carefully, one piece, the smallest one, the one with the sapphires that matched nothing except this dress, which meant she had kept it in mind since March and planned for it. He looked at the pin, he looked at her. "My mother would have approved of the choice," he said. She touched the pin briefly. "I hoped she might," she said. They went down the stairs together. Myra was in the front hall in a different role tonight, the role of person staying home, which she had taken with the specific grace of someone who understood that some evenings are designed for 2 people rather than 3, and who was planning to spend the night in the library with the botanical references and a pot of Cook's Better tea. "Don't do anything interesting without me," Myra said as they were going out. "We'll do our best," Seraphine said. In the carriage they were quiet for the first few minutes, the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. "If you'd like to leave early," Seraphine said, "we leave early. I want you to know that's available." He looked at her. "I don't think I'll want to leave early." She nodded. "But thank you," he said, "for offering." She looked out the window. The June evening was long and warm, the sky not yet dark, the hedgerows in full color as the carriage moved through the lanes. The Hartley house was larger than the Fennec house and managed its size with the efficiency of a well-run institution. Lord Hartley was a solid, cheerful man who genuinely liked people, which was rare enough in his position to be remarkable. Lady Hartley was his match in warmth, and slightly his superior in organization. The assembly they hosted was, consistently, the social event of the summer season, because it was attended by people who actually wanted to be there, which produced a better quality of gathering than obligation usually allowed. Aldrich walked into the Hartley assembly room with his wife beside him and felt, for the first time at one of these events, like he was occupying the space he was in fully rather than managing it from a controlled distance. They moved through the room. They spoke to people. He watched Seraphine do the thing she was extraordinary at, moving through social geography with ease and attention, giving each person she spoke to the specific and genuine quality of interest that made them feel found rather than managed. He watched her and thought, not for the first time and with increasing ease, that she was remarkable, not in the obvious ways, in the true ways, the ones that took longer to see and lasted permanently once you had seen them. Lady Ross was there, as expected. He saw her across the room before she saw him, which was not particularly significant but felt like it. She looked the same. She always looked the same, the beauty that was a project and the maintenance of it as disciplined as ever. She was talking to someone he recognized vaguely, a county figure of middling significance. She saw him eventually. Their eyes met across the room in the brief and unavoidable way that eyes meet at gatherings. He nodded, the nod of acknowledgement and nothing more. She nodded back. He turned back to the person he was speaking to and finished the conversation about the drainage improvements on the North Field, which was a subject he actually found interesting, and which the person he was speaking to was knowledgeable about, and the conversation was genuinely useful. He never thought about Lady Ross again that evening. This was the fact that told him everything was exactly as it was. Not that she had appeared, not that he had managed her appearance with fortitude or courage or any kind of deliberate effort, that he had seen her and nodded, and turned back to the person he was speaking to about drainage because drainage was more interesting and more real and more present to him. 4 years of her living in his chest as a reason and a warning and a proof. 4 years of her as the evidence for the case he had built. And now she was a woman across a room at an assembly, and he had a wife beside him in his mother's sapphire pin, and the drainage conversation was genuinely interesting, and that was the entire measure of it. He found Seraphine near the end of the evening. She was finishing a conversation near the windows. She saw him coming and said something final to the person she was speaking with, and then turned and came to him, and they stood together for a moment at the edge of the room with the summer evening through the windows behind them. "Ready?" she asked. "Yes," he said. They said their goodbyes and went to the carriage and rode home through the late June evening, which was not yet fully dark even at 10, the sky holding the last of the summer light in a long, unwilling performance. "How was it?" she asked in the carriage. "Good," he said. "It was good." She looked at him. She could read him well enough now to know that good meant several things, and she waited to see which one he wanted to offer. "Lady Ross was across the room," he said. I nodded to her. "I spent the rest of the evening talking about drainage and 2 other useful things, and I came to find you and we left." He looked at her steadily. "That was the whole of it." She was quiet for a moment. "The whole of it," she said. "Yes." She looked out the window. The light was finally letting go of the sky, the last of it going in the west, and the night was warm and full, the kind that has the memory of summer even before summer is over. "I'm glad," she said, simply, without dramatizing it. He looked at her profile against the window, the pin at her collar, the calm of her face that was not blankness but sureness, the sureness of a person who has been right about something important and doesn't need to make a performance of being right. He was, he thought, the luckiest man in the county. He was not entirely sure when that had become the accurate description of his situation. Somewhere between October and June, between a letter on a Wednesday and a hand turned over on a breakfast table, between 43 counted steps and a prayer he had not been meant to hear. He had not chosen this year. It had been given to him, the way all the best and most permanent things are given, without being asked for, in the form of something that looks completely different from what you imagined it would look like. It had looked like a woman in a dark blue traveling dress who looked at his house like she was trying to understand it, who said I've managed worse without explaining what worse was, who found accounting errors in 10 minutes, and named a grey mare Fern, and stood outside a stable in January in the cold, and stayed there because staying was the thing that was needed. That was what it had looked like. He would not have chosen it, he had needed it to be given. He was grateful for the giving. The carriage came through the estate gate and up the drive, and the house was lit at the entrance and the rest of it in its nighttime dark, and inside Myra was in the library with the botanical references and the better tea, and the dogs were wherever they had decided to be, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. He thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere you had not known you were going. He thought it felt exactly like this. Summer settled over the Voss estate with the generous permanence that the best summers achieve, the kind where each day is full enough to feel like two and still goes by before it's fully used. Myra's 2-week visit became 3 weeks, which became a month, which became a standing arrangement that nobody announced but everyone accepted. Lord Callow sent a letter in early July saying she might stay as long as she was welcome, which was the fullest hospitality he had managed to extend since his wife died, and which cost him almost nothing since Myra was already in the habit of managing her own affairs with minimal input from him. She was in the south garden most mornings, she had filled 4 of her notebooks, she had begun a 5th one. She had identified in the old orchard a species of apple tree that appeared in no catalogue, and which she suspected was a very old variety that had been considered extinct since the previous century, and about which she had now written to a botanist at a university in London who had replied, rather urgently, that he would like to come and see it. Aldrich had read this letter over her shoulder at breakfast, which was the kind of thing he did now, the small, unannounced familiarities that had grown up in the household in June and July without announcement. He had read it and then gone immediately to Perrin to ask about the old orchard, and whether the trees had ever been documented, and Perrin had said that as far as he knew they'd just always been there, which was the definitive estate knowledge on the subject. The botanist was coming in August. Myra was radiant about this in the controlled way of a woman who has learned from her sister to hold her joy at a manageable volume in public. Seraphine watched her sister and said at dinner, "She's going to write a paper." "Yes," Aldrich said. "With her name on it." "Yes." Seraphine looked at her plate for a moment, then she said, "My mother would have been beside herself." He did not ask what she meant by that. He knew what she meant. He said, "Tell me about her." She looked up. "Your mother," he said, "I've told you about mine, tell me about yours." She looked at him for a moment with the look he had come to know, and which he still thought was the best thing he had ever been looked at with, the one that was recognition and warmth, and the specific thing that had no name but which was real, more real than most things. She told him. She talked about her mother for a long time, through the end of dinner and into the drawing room, the things a woman who died when her daughters were 12 and 8 had been and done and said, the particular way she laughed and what she had taught Seraphine about running a house, and what Seraphine had had to teach herself because the instruction had ended too soon. She talked and Aldrich listened the way he had learned to listen to her, which was with all of it, not waiting for a pause but receiving each piece as it arrived. Myra, who had come to the drawing room with her notebook, and was sitting on the floor near the fire because that was where Myra preferred to be, put her notebook down at some point and just listened too. When Seraphine finished, the fire had gone lower and the room was warm and quiet. She would have liked this house, Myra said from the floor. Yes, Seraphine said. She would have liked him, Myra said, indicating Aldrich with the frank gesture of a 20-year-old who had stopped moderating her assessments over the course of the summer. Yes, Seraphine said. She looked at Aldrich when she said it. He received that look and held it and thought about the year that had just happened to him, the specific and improbable sequence of it. She would have found the bays useful, he said. Seraphine looked at him. My mother kept bees, he said. She always said you needed someone who could manage them. She could never find anyone who had the patience for it. Seraphine was quiet for a moment, then she said, I know how to keep bees. He looked at her. My mother taught me, she said, before she died. I haven't had bees since Staffordshire because the Callow hives were dismantled after she died and I never had the time to start new ones. The fire moved. Myra was completely still on the floor, holding her notebook with the look of someone bearing witness to something and knowing it. The kitchen garden, he said. East corner. Mrs. Holt said the gardener's been talking about hives for 2 years but no one knew how to manage them. I could manage them, she said. I know you could, he said. She was very still. In the autumn, he said, when the season is right for it, we'll set up hives. She looked at him, and the thing without a name was entirely visible in her face, and he let himself see it, which he could do now, which was a thing he could not have done in October, and which he could do now without any of the alarm that used to come with it. He was not afraid of being seen by her. He had not known how much of his life had been organized around that fear until the fear was gone. July was the month of the chapel. Not the early morning chapel of the dark winter months, that solitary private practice she had maintained in the cold and never spoken about. The July chapel was different. It began on a Sunday in the middle of the month, when the morning was warm and still, and Aldrich was awake before the house, and had come downstairs with no particular destination, and found himself outside in the garden in the early light. He walked to the chapel. He had been walking to it in his mind for months, and it seemed, finally, time to close the distance in the other direction. The door was closed. This was the Sunday morning version, not the weekday dawn version. He knocked. He did not know why he knocked, he simply did. A brief pause, then come in. He went in. She was in the second pew from the front, which is where she was most mornings. The north window was doing its particular thing with the light, the cold white of it that made every object in the room look clear and actual and real. The room smelled like stone and candle wax and the faint outdoors of the garden path. She looked at him with a look that was surprise, and then, almost immediately, not surprise. As if he had arrived at a door she had been expecting and had not known she was expecting. He sat down beside her. They did not speak for several minutes. The chapel was quiet with a quality of quiet that was different from the rest of the house, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something that noise would interrupt. He was not a man of great religious certainty. He had not been in this chapel since his mother used it, but he was a man who understood, sitting here in the Sunday morning in June, that there are places where people go to be honest, truly and privately honest, with no performance and no management, and that what happened in those places had the quality of something real in a way that most things didn't. He had heard what she said here. He wanted now to be in the same room where it had been said. "I didn't expect you," she said, quietly, not a complaint. "I know," he said. "You could have come inside any morning," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't ready." She looked at him, the chapel version of her look, which was the most unguarded version, the version without the management of public appearances or the careful composure of someone who has been managing things for a long time. Just her. "And now," she said. "Now I am," he said. The morning held them there for a while. The light through the north window moved as the sun moved in its summer arc, slow and golden, and the garden was audible distantly through the old stone, birds and leaves, and the early sounds of the estate beginning its day. He thought about the year. The letter in September, the apple he'd forgotten, was in his hand. October and the steps, and a woman who looked at his house like she was trying to understand it. November and the wedding in the frost and the rose petals and the accounting errors. December and the chapel visits beginning and the 43 counted steps. January and Wick and the note on the tray. February and Fern and the botanical map. March and Myra's letter and the thing he had said about the debts. April and the garden corner and the offer to let himself be seen. May and the east gate and the names spoken naturally. June and the dawn and the chapel door and his name said in prayer. And now this. A chapel in July, side by side, the north window. "I owe you something," he said. She looked at him. "An apology," he said. "A real one, not the formal version, for the year, not for agreeing to the arrangement that was circumstance, but for the distance. For maintaining it beyond what was necessary, beyond what was fair. I kept you at a remove because I had decided in advance that the remove was protection. It wasn't protection. It was damage of a different kind." She was quiet. "You were more than fair," he said, "more than honest, more than anyone was required to be in an arrangement they didn't choose, and I gave you less than you deserved for it." She looked at the altar, she looked at the north window, she looked at her hands. "You gave me more than I expected," she said. "I want you to know that I know the difference between those two things. More than I expected is not the same as what I deserved, but it's what I hoped for." He looked at her. "In the beginning," she said, "I told myself I wasn't hoping. I told Myra I wasn't hoping. I was very convincing about it, actually." She almost smiled. I was hoping the whole time, I just wasn't admitting it. He thought about a 20-year-old woman on her knees in the difficult corner of a garden. The carefully not hoped-for thing, the sister who learned it from the sister, the family curriculum of managed expectations and private hope. "You can hope out loud now," he said. She looked at him. The morning was quiet around them. "Can I?" she said, not a question, a testing of the idea, the way you press on ground to see if it will hold. "Yes," he said. She looked at the north window. The light was moving across the floor of the chapel in the slow way of light in old stone rooms, not hurrying. "I hope," she said, "that the bees thrive." "They will," he said. "I hope Myra's paper makes her name in botanical circles, in the way that someone should have made her name years ago." "It will," he said. "I hope," she said more quietly, "that you are well, that the thing that was closed that I prayed about is open." He had heard those exact words before, or close to them, through an open door in the early June dark without her knowing he was listening. "It is," he said. "I can tell you that. You can stop praying for it and put the space to something else." She was still for a moment. Then she said, "That's not how it works. You don't stop praying for someone because the situation improved. You continue because you value them." He had nothing to say to that. He sat with it, the weight and the plain honesty of it, the specific clarity of a woman who says true things without dressing them. He took her hand, his right and her left there in the pew in the north window light. "I value you," he said, "in case that needs saying." She turned her hand the way she had turned it on the breakfast table in June, the same gesture, the same signal. "It does need saying," she said. "Sometimes, not always, but sometimes." "Then I'll say it sometimes," he said. "When it needs saying, I'm better at the specific than the general." She smiled, the real one, the one that didn't need to be managed. "I know," she said. "I've noticed." They sat in the chapel until the house was fully awake, and the smell of breakfast was coming over the garden wall, and Myra was presumably already in her garden with her notebook, and the morning light she had been given in the green room was already doing what he had arranged it to do. He lit a candle before they left. He was not entirely sure what he was lighting it for, something general, something that encompassed the year and the house and the woman beside him and the bees they were going to keep and the botanist who was coming in August and the corner with the difficult light. She watched him light it. She did not say anything. But she looked at it, and the look she gave it was the same look she had given the rose petals on the frost on the morning of the wedding, which he had stored without understanding it at the time and understood now. It was the look of someone receiving something they had hoped for and were allowing themselves to receive. He opened the chapel door and the morning came in, warm and full and completely available, the summer at its height, the south gardens audible and fragrant, and doing the work she had set them to, and the house beyond them solid and true and entirely his. Entirely theirs. They walked back through the garden together in the morning light, his hand finding hers on the path the way you find something you've been looking for, which is not in the dramatic moment of discovery, but in the ordinary moment of realizing it was beside you all along. The dogs were at the kitchen door, which was open because Cook opened it at this hour for the morning air. Breck and Doss came out at the sound of footsteps and performed their usual greeting, which was comprehensive and unrestrained and entirely without dignity, and which was, Aldrich had long understood, the most accurate emotional commentary available in the household. Myra was crossing the garden from the orchard with her notebook, her skirt already hemmed with damp from the morning grass. She saw them. She looked at their hands, she looked at their faces. She said nothing. She wrote something in her notebook which he suspected was not about the apple tree. He was fine with that. He was better than fine. He was standing in the morning of a summer that had been given to him in October in the form of a letter he had not wanted, in the garden of a house he had thought was finished with the possibility of being a home, in the company of a woman he had spent a year being afraid of, and would spend whatever came after being grateful for, entirely well. He was well. She had prayed for it before the sun was up in the cold of a December morning, when he was sleeping, and had no idea what was being offered on his behalf in that small cold room. He was well. It was the best outcome available. It was, in fact, better than that. He had not known that better than that was a category. He knew now. He led her through the kitchen door into the warmth and the smell of the morning, and the dogs came with them, and Myra was already talking, and the house was awake and running, and his mother's sapphires were on the shelf in the blue room waiting for the next occasion that deserved them, and the bees would come in autumn, and the botanist would come in August, and the apple tree that had been in the old orchard all along without anyone knowing what it was would have a name before the year was out. Everything that was going to be named would eventually be named. The ones that were harder to name were not missing, they were just being lived. Day by day, in the ordinary and sufficient and entirely true shape of a life that had been given rather than chosen, and received, finally, with both hands open.